Good morning, and welcome to the University of California, Irvine. I am John Gould. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Ecology here at UCI. In social ecology, we like to say that we don't just study or teach about societal problems, we also seek to solve them. And we do that in partnership. We do that in partnership with nonprofit groups, with government, with business. UCI is also Orange County's hometown research university. But the OC of today is hardly the county that was existing at the time that the university was founded, which was just about 60 years ago. Where Orange County was once a bright red Republican bastion, it is now one of just 3 purple counties among the 25 most populous in the country. Now, let me say that again so it sinks in, because there's kind of this national sense that we are this bright red county. We are truly purple. Of the 25 most populous in the nation, there are only 3 that are purple. One of them is Maricopa County, Arizona, that's Phoenix. The other one is Tarrant County, Texas, that's Fort Worth. And then there's us. But neither of those other 2 have had a movie or television shows written about them, so we're special. Orange County also continued its purple trend in last month's election. Although the county went narrowly for Kamala Harris, voters also chose Steve Garvey for Senate. And while Dave Min, the Democrat, won, and Derek Tran also flipped the 45th congressional district for Democrats, I see a little bit who our audience is today. Nevertheless, Min's win was by a smaller percentage than Katie Porter had carried that district the last 2 cycles, and even Derek Tran lost within Orange County. We should also note that the results of the election have been quite a surprise to many Orange County voters. Just this morning, our school, the School of Social Ecology, has released a post-election poll. And what that post-election poll found was that 62% of Orange County adults and 78% of Harris supporters were surprised by the election. Even half of Trump's supporters were surprised by the results. And these reactions skew even more sharply when we're asking voters about their emotional response to the election. So half of Trump's supporters here in Orange County are relieved by the results, whereas half of Harris's supporters are afraid by the results. Just 1/4 of Orange County adults tell us that they are hopeful from the election's results. So how do we get here? What's it mean? And where do we go from here? That's the focus of this morning's conversation. And we are very fortunate to have a talented group of panelists encompassing journalists, data analysts, and elected leaders to help us tease through these questions. I should add, we are not providing therapy at this morning's event, although we do have a new psychological services clinic in the School of Social Ecology. But this is an analysis today. This is to hear from reporters, it's to hear from data analysts, it's to hear from elected leaders about what happened, what's it mean, and where do we go from here. We have 3 different panels. The first one will be focused on an insider's look at the campaigns and a discussion of strategies. The second will examine trends and changes in the vote. And a final panel will consider implications from the election for the future of the Democratic and Republican parties, both here and nationwide, and also the future of Orange County and the nation. You should feel free to come and go during the sessions today. We will have, and actually I would encourage you mainly to do that at the breaks between panels. We will continue to have coffee out in the atria. I was going to say that the rules of the Beckman Center prohibit food and drink from being inside here, but you know what? What I don't see, I don't know about. But most importantly in the introductions, I would be remiss in not thanking our partner and co-host in today's event, the Los Angeles Times, which has also shared many of its talented reporters and editors with us. And Cindy Chang, wherever you are, you get a big shout out for being the coordinator behind this with the LA Times. I also want to thank the Haynes Foundation for their support of the UCI OC poll, which we produced here in the School of Social Ecology. As I mentioned, we released our post-election poll results this morning, some of which will actually be discussed on the second panel. You can use the QR code up there on the screen, or there's a one-pager out front that you can use the QR code to download what the results are. Now, I'm going to suggest that you wait until the end of today's sessions to do that. I promise you we'll put the QR code back up at the end because we want you to focus on our panelists this morning. But the poll results will be available for you. Think of them as like a party favor as you leave after the treats that we're going to provide you today. Also, if any of you represent or lead an organization that wants to discuss these results in greater detail, please let me know. We're always happy to come be the entertainment at any of your events. With that, let me ask the members of the first panel to please come up and take your seats if you wouldn't mind. And for those of you who don't remember who you are, that would be Mark, Melanie, Jenny, Seema, and Mike. While they are doing that, I am going to introduce the moderator of our panel, Mike Madrid. So for anyone who has followed California politics over the years, Mike is a legend in the state and beyond, although I know he will say he's not. Earlier in his career, he served as the political director of the California Republican Party, although many of you probably know him as one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project. An authority on Latino politics, Mike recently published the excellent book, The Latino Century, on that very subject. And closer to home and closer to my heart, we are fortunate that Mike serves as a senior fellow in the School of Social Ecology. Mike, thanks very much for facilitating this panel, and we look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. We'll debate the legend adjective in just a few moments with this esteemed panel. I do a lot of these postmortems. It's keeping me really busy on the road quite a bit. But I have to say, of all of them, when I was asked to kind of help advise on who we could get together for this event, I was like, I think I want to put the dream team together of the people that I spent all the time in the last 18 months talking to people, the brains out there that can kind of share what they're seeing on the ground and what's happening in the races. And so much of my time is spent talking to reporters on a daily basis. I thought this is the opportunity where I'm going to get and just ask if we can kind of pull a panel together. And that really became the culmination, I think, of the four people with me today. You have their bios. They're obviously extraordinarily accomplished, but I think you're going to find out why they are who they are and why they're writing and analyzing and reporting at the level that they are in just a few minutes. I'm going to ask them to give us 5 minutes of kind of their own overview of what happened in just a moment, but I do want to acknowledge them by name. You have their bios again with you in the brochures that you've got as you came in. But Seema Mehta from the Los Angeles Times. Seema, round of applause for Seema. I feel like that Jeb Bush meme, right, where he's saying applause, please. That's that applause line. Mark Zieberback, Mark, a dear friend for many, many years, Los Angeles Times. Jenny Medina from the New York Times. And Melanie Mason at Politico. Thank you guys so much for being here. I know that you're all really, really busy doing the analysis of what happened. And so with that, I'm going to begin with Seema and ask, what happened?
I think we'll be talking about that for quite some time because this election was really, unlike anything I've ever seen before. First, you had, the Democratic nominee, the president, deciding not to run for re-election. Kamala Harris becoming the Democratic nominee, and then having a very, very tight sprint in to election day, and then you had Donald Trump, obviously, 2 assassination attempts. So it was a crazy year. It's like usually the summer is kind of calm. This summer was not calm. Beyond that, I think one of the things I think Democrats are really going to look at in the aftermath of Kamala Harris's loss is things that have traditionally worked for them, whether it's a big, having a huge ground game, having a ton of money, having all these celebrities out there, thinking of Barack Obama in 2008, things that traditionally have worked for them did not work this time around. And it's There's certainly many other factors, whether it's the economy, how they address the economy, just voters' concerns, and the fact that Kamala Harris had a very, very short runway to get her campaign together. But also there is something about Donald Trump's message that has resonated with the majority of Americans, and I think Democrats have some sort of soul searching to do about their messaging and how they reach out to voters, and especially with the voting blocs that traditionally voted for them. I mean, the losses that they saw among the working class, among minorities, including particularly Black and Latino men, which makes me think of Arizona. When I was out there with some canvassers, this one woman who was a Latina from LA who was knocking on doors, and she just told me about the number of Latino men who were going to vote for Ruben Gallego, but we're not going to vote for Kamala Harris. And so there is the question of these traditional blocs that have. I mean, it's still obviously most minority groups do traditionally support Democrats, but they have seen losses that are impacting this coalition that they built. And and we're seeing this sort of realignment in politics in terms of who does the working class support, who do college educated voters support, demographically, economically. So I think there's just going to be a real investigation into the realignment of American politics that's taking place right now. Now, I think Orange County is a perfect example of that. I mean, I started working in Orange County in 1999 when I was a baby reporter many, many years ago, and it was bright red. And then in 2016, it was the first time that Orange County voted for a Democrat since the Great Depression. And so I mean, then this time it was very close, but still, it's a perfect example of how the voting populations are changing, and whether it's suburban college-educated women or or minority groups. I mean, there's just a realignment taking place that I think we're going to be talking about for quite some time.
The changing nature of both parties, I think, is one of the real fascinating stories, and we can talk a little bit about how long that's been happening. Is it just a function of the moment? But I think one of the things that was most glaring about those changes and that transformation was those ticket splitters that you were talking about in Arizona. This Gallego Trump voter in Arizona.
And the question is it misogyny? Is it or do they just know Gallego better? I mean, he's a veteran.
Or was just Carrie Lake just that bad, right? Like there's a whole lot of dynamics at play. I know, Mark, you have written and thought a lot about this, and I wanted you to kind of, well, let me first ask what happened, but I also want you to kind of to go down that rabbit hole a little bit, if you don't mind.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Mike, legend. So, all right, I scribbled down some thoughts this morning when I rolled out of bed, and we'll see how this goes. I want to start a point of personal privilege. I make it a habit every election day to tweet out the observation that people who have no idea what's going to happen in the next 24 hours are going to spend the next 4 years telling you why it was inevitable, right? So none of this was inevitable. In retrospect, some things become very, very clear. The polls got it right. They said it was going to be a close election. It was a very, very close election. Donald Trump ran a very strange, kind of bifurcated campaign, if you will, very strong, if you will, on the professional messaging side. As a candidate, he was weird. I mean, he was talking about Hannibal Lecter and electrocution and all that stuff. It was a very strange thing, and people kind of forget that now. But like that scene where he's like swaying to music for half an hour in Pennsylvania, it was just a very weird, like I said, bifurcated campaign. Kamala Harris, by contrast, I thought ran a very, very, very good campaign. I along with my colleague Melanie, wrote and chronicled her crash and burn 2000 campaign. She ran, I thought, a very, very good campaign. She had a terrific convention, cleaned the floor with Trump in the one debate they had. Not that it matters in the end. Can be criticized. I think if there was a one huge glaring mistake, it was that moment on The View when she was asked if she'd do anything. Can you think of anything different you would do? She said nothing. I don't know if that speaks to, having covered Kamala for a very, very long time, and I guess I feel familiar enough that I can call her Kamala and not Vice President Harris. She's terrific at the set piece, like a convention or a congressional hearing or something she can prepare for. She's never been very good on the fly. I don't know how on the fly The View was. She had to have anticipated that question, how are you going to separate yourself from Biden? I'm not saying that's why she lost. In fact, the fundamentals were very much working against her. And I've had, and as Mike will tell you, spent a lot of time on the phone talking to very smart people like Mike and others. And a question I've asked everyone over and over is, was this a race that Kamala Harris lost, or did she put up a really good fight in what was going to be a very, very uphill effort? And most people seem to feel it was the latter, that it was really, really tough. Why? Well, because we go to the fundamentals. it's really hard to be a turn-the-page candidate when you've co-authored the narrative, right? Fairly or not, and I did a column to this effect. I mean, it's utterly fallacious and ridiculous, this notion. Well, Kamala Harris was vice president for 4 years. Why didn't she fix the border? Why didn't she do this? Why didn't she cure cancer? Why didn't she send a rocket ship to the moon? Because she's vice president. That's the short answer. Okay. That's the short answer. But that said, she was part of the Biden-Harris administration. And when you have a president who's at 40% approval, I mean, look at history. That is just a flashing red light. Exit polls showed 73% of voters had a negative view, not happy, angry, dissatisfied with the direction of the country. 40% approval for Biden. That's a very, very tough environment. And inflation is a killer. You look in modern times, who's run during periods or after periods of inflation? Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter. Joe Biden didn't run, but Kamala Harris did. All of them lost. I think there's a reason for that. It is, and it's a cliche, so indulge me. It was the economy, stupid, at the end of the day. I talked to actually at the airport yesterday. Like I said, I spent a lot of time talking to smart people on the phone. I was talking to a pollster named David Winston, Republican pollster. He's been doing it for decades. He's a consultant to CBS News, and he had some really interesting stuff I want to share with you about the modeling of the electorate. And these numbers I'm going to give you are 2000 versus 2000. I'm sorry, 2020 versus 2024. Democrats in 2020 made up 37% of the electorate. 31% this time, okay? Republicans, 36% of the electorate 4 years ago, 35% this time. Independents went from 27% of the electorate to 34% this time. This is the first time since the Watergate era that one of the two major parties fell below, or in third place, if you will. Big question, and I can't give you an answer. The big question, did the Democratic turnout fall off because Democrats stayed home, or these people who were Democrats who voted Republican or felt Republican, or call themselves independent but voted? That's going to take more survey research to figure that out. That we don't know. But we do know that the economy is super, super important, in particular to independents, right? Both parties held on to their base, right? There are people who would, crawl through broken glass to vote for Donald Trump, and there are people who would, shove grandma over a cliff to vote for Kamala Harris. They don't decide elections, right? It's the independents. It's that middle ground, if you will. And what is the issue that's time and again has been shown to be most important to independents? It's the economy. They're very cross-pressured by economic issues, inflation, those sorts of things. And going here to some of the data that David shared with me, which I thought was really, really interesting. What messaging did people receive from? So, it doesn't matter how much Kamala talked about this or Trump talked about that. What message did people receive? And the top two messages they got from Republicans were the border, which you can conflate the way the issue has been discussed. You can conflate that with crime, and the economy. And what were the two top messages that voters and independents in particular were getting from Kamala Harris? It was abortion and threats to democracy, right? So if you really care a lot about the economy and the cross pressures and the price of eggs that's another cliche, the price of eggs, the price of bacons, but that mattered a lot to people. And the message they were getting from Trump and the Republicans was more related to the economy than what they were hearing from Kamala Harris. It's just as simple as that. All of that said, very, very close election. Okay, not so much in the Electoral College, but you look at Trump's winning margin, which I checked this morning, the popular vote, 1.47% right now. The closest since 2000, and historically one of the closest periods. So this was not a blowout election. I mean, yes, Trump swept all 7 of the battleground states. It was not a blowout. He had very, very short coattails, right? The Democrats picked up a House seat. The Republicans didn't make very big gains in legislative seats. And I'll go back a lot of years, but in 1994, the year of the famous Republican Revolution, Republicans actually took over the state house in California. So you had a red wave up and down the ballot. Didn't have that this time. Giving credit where it's due, I think you could say Trump had coattails in, take a step back. The Senate was going to go Republican, just period, full stop. Democrats were going to lose West Virginia, which they did. They were going to lose Montana, which they did. Ohio is a very, very Republican state. They lost there. I would argue that if Trump had any coattails, it was in Pennsylvania, a swing state where he carried David McCormick across. All of that said, I'm going to go back to the whole discussion. Oh, one other interesting point I want to make about the Senate. In 2016, for the first time since we had the direct election of senators in 100 years, every state that voted a certain way for president voted the same way for Senate. We saw that again in 2020 with the exception of Maine, where Susan Collins, Biden carried Maine, Susan Collins, Republican, won that state. This time we had 4 states, interestingly, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where Trump won the state, but a Democrat won the Senate seat. So that's an interesting thing. And the last thing I want to mention is the whole question of mandates. You know, a mandate is kind of like this magic trick that politicians conjure up. Well, I have a mandate. Why? Because you say you have a mandate. You'll note I've been very careful not to make any predictions here. I left the predictions business in 2016. But there was a very, I'm not going to tell you Trump's going to succeed, Trump's going to fail, this, that, the other thing, but I am going to read you something, and I'm not like checking my phone while I'm talking to you because that'd be like really weird and rude, but I have something here that I want to read, which is the best summation I saw, the most concise and best summation post-election of the whole mandate thing. This is from a gentleman, Yuval Levin, who works at the American Enterprise Institute. And he says, and I'm quoting him here, in the 21st century, presidents win because their opponents were unpopular, and then, imagining the public has endorsed their party's activist agenda, they use the power of their office to make themselves unpopular. End quote, which is why we just saw the 3rd straight presidential election in which the White House flipped parties. We have not seen that since the 19th century. So, interesting time.
That's fascinating. And one other point to all of that is this is the 2nd presidential election in a row where the incumbent party has lost and picked up seats in the House. So there's a very there's a method to the madness, it would appear, to your point, about how voters are discerning what's actually going on and why they're making the decisions that they're doing. Incidentally, Orange County since 2016 has been one of those counties, as Dean Gould pointed out, that has that most distinctive characteristic. The voting behaviors in the House compared to what's happening at the top of the ticket have been really remarkable to kind of understand in both the midterms and the presidential since 2016. One of the really fascinating states in this battleground, 7-state battleground scenario that we've looked at was the state of Nevada. And I know, Jenny, you've done a lot of research and looking at this, reporting about it, being there, talking about it. I think you're doing some more research on it now. A lot of us, I think, kind of view Nevada as sort of this suburb of California, right? And what the folks that we are exporting become the new characteristics of how that party is going to vote. Nevada had one unique, distinct characteristics of being one of the only battleground states that was actually trending more Republican, while all the others were trending more Democratic. But when the early votes were coming in, I think we started to see something might be happening tonight on Tuesday night. And so without getting too much more into Nevada's analysis, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about Nevada, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I could talk about Nevada all day, practically, so I'll keep myself limited. I would say that Nevada actually can encapsulate the entire country right now and the shifts that we're seeing. And I'll try to just tell you. So my job is reporting on voters, so it's not very glamorous. I'm never on Air Force One. Most of my time is spent in parking lots of strip malls, and there are many in Nevada. We've exported strip malls there very effectively. And talking with people. And so one of my favorite examples of this is during the midterm elections, I was reporting on the economy, and I was in front of a Mexican grocery store in East Las Vegas, and I came across this barber shop that had on its window painted one of those old barbershop poles, and it was painted red, white, and blue, and then it said on there, working class. And I go into this barbershop, and it's these 2 guys who've been friends forever. They've run this barbershop for 20 years together. One guy both of them grew up with fathers who were in the union, they were bartenders, or I think one was a carpenter union. And one guy is like a diehard Democrat, pissed at Joe Biden, but he's like, I would never ever vote for Trump. The other guy voted for Obama, and had become a hardcore Trumper. And the whole barbershop, which is catering almost exclusively to men, certainly exclusively to men, and almost exclusively to Latino men, and really what that meant in Vegas is Mexican-American men. And the whole clientele had shifted more and more and more Trump. And I started going there in 2022, and I went back to this barbershop an embarrassing number of times, don't tell my editor, like 10 times over the course of a couple years, and then eventually wrote about it. The Trump guy, the Republican guy who ran the barbershop, ended up becoming one of my favorite sources. You know, guys like Mike spend hours analyzing data to come up with their fun quotes. This guy just spouted off all the time. And no offense, Mike, he was right almost as much of the time as you.
All right, okay. A legend. He's a legend.
You, the two of you, we should get you both together for a beer. You guys would have fun. But I spent, I think I would say between January of 2024 and November of 2024. My guess is I went to Nevada like 15 times and spent an enormous amount of time there. And every time I went, it seemed more and more Trumpy. The vast majority of people who I was talking to, the vast majority of people in Las Vegas and in Nevada, Las Vegas is the overwhelming majority population of the state, are working class. And many of those people are not non-white working class. And the number of people who I talked to who were not white and who were working class and were voting for Trump went up every single time that I was going there. And, you know, I kept being surprised, but the things that they were saying stayed kind of consistent. So many of I would tell you, the vast majority of these voters who I'm talking to, and it's not scientific, it's not a poll with a margin of error, but I'm talking about hundreds of non-white working class Trump voters. All voted for Obama in 2008. All voted for Obama in 2012. Many voted for Clinton in 2016. Some even voted for Biden in 2020. The idea that what I heard again and again is like this promise of hope and change is, we're in a university, is BS. It didn't change my life. My life isn't better. I actually am struggling more than I used to. I can't afford where I live. My kids can't afford where they want to live. I have my 25-year-old son still in my house. Yes, we're employed, but sometimes we're employed with 2 jobs. I'm employed with, I have one regular job, and then I have a side hustle delivering Amazon or running Uber or running some sort of billing practice out of my house. I mean, everybody's just hustling. And the amount of distrust in institutions across the board, schools, healthcare, media, is just so high, and cynicism. And when you talk about fundamentals, and Mark was talking about sort of what changed, I went back out there in August, right after Harris had become the nominee. And if you looked online at that time, everybody was getting coconut pilled. Everybody was so excited. And I went to, again, mostly in non-white neighborhoods. I talked to a group of 8 middle-aged Black men who were like, They were still feeling really cynical, not impressed. I went to a campaign event in a Harris office, and I talked to these 2 women. One was 23, one was 21. I said, how did you guys end up here? Turned out one woman was there because her boyfriend worked for the campaign, and then she invited her friend who she worked with at the bank to come with her. And it was a very weird, interesting, fun, creative outreach program. It was the Paint and Sip. Do you guys know Paint and Sip? Where you drink wine and do like a color by number with paint. It was that kind of an event. I was like, so why did you come? So, my friend made me come to support her boyfriend. So I said, so are you excited? This is a week after Harris has announced her candidacy. Are you excited to vote for Harris? They're like, no, I'm not going to vote. Why? My vote doesn't matter. Really? You're in Nevada. You're like in the most important swing state. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Whatever happens is going to be the same. And I heard that over and over and over again.
One of the most difficult things to happen in my career, clearly, was losing my hair, because I don't get to go to barbershops as often to understand what's happening.
They do buzz cuts.
We'll do buzz cuts, too. Melanie, hold on. I'm going to do a little wind up here.
Give me up, yeah.
Yeah. Always, every time I'm like in a really significant conundrum about what is happening in the world, certainly in our political system, I get a call from Melanie asking me an even more complicated question, which makes me go, I'm gonna have to get back to you on this. I just needed to clear my mind and think about this. But some of the really, I think, fascinating stories in California, but also nationally that have come out, I think, came off of your keyboard and your brain. So you promised to surprise us a little bit, do a little bit of cleanup. It's always tough to go last on these introduction panels, but with that setup, whatever it meant, tell us what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this esteemed panel sort of covered ground. So I'll just sort of try and insert a couple of other observations, but then we can get, kind of keep the conversation going. I mean, the first, which I think Mark or Mike or one of you alluded to, is obviously there is an inherent power in incumbency in general, but man, this election cycle, being an incumbent was a tough place to be. And by the way, that's not just in the United States. I mean, that is something that we have seen globally now, and that is not necessarily an ideological thing. I mean, look at what we saw in the UK, for example. The Tory government got trounced. There is clearly a global frustration, anti-incumbent sentiment that was pretty overwhelming. And I think that if you wanted to trace back to when did Democrats lose this election, I'd probably argue that they lost it after having a better than expected 2022, which let Joe Biden think that he could kind of pull this one off, and they didn't have an off-ramp to change nominees. And so then you were running with an incumbent in a time when both in the nation and in the world there was a pretty strong anti-incumbent sentiment. One of the conversations I had recently, actually, after the last House race in California was called, because in California, Democrats actually did pretty well in these battleground House districts. They won 4 out of the 6 main battlegrounds that we're watching, flipping 3 Republican seats. And I was talking to Lorena Gonzalez, who runs the California Labor Fed, whose members were out quite a bit. And one of the things that she said is, at the doors, we were not talking in partisan terms at all. This was not a vote for the Democrat. It was, they were trying to oust incumbent Republicans. So it was get rid of the person who's in office. So while Democrats on the sort of top of the ticket had a hard time saying stick with this administration and sort of this quasi-incumbent, at least in these House races, they were able to use the incumbency weapon against these Republicans. And so, I think that obviously that means, to Mark's point about a mandate, Donald Trump now and Republicans control 3 branches of government. In 2 years, if voter sentiment is as frustrated and as disillusioned as it has been for years now, then it's their turn to sort of explain to people why they're feeling frustrated, why they feel like there hasn't been enough change. A sort of corollary to that, and I swear to God, I'm not ripping off an Atlantic article that made the same point. I have timestamp proof that I said it in a group chat 2 hours before that got published. But I do think that this was kind of the delayed pandemic reaction election. And I think that's in a lot of senses. I mean, I think that the economy is the number one reason. I mean, so much of the inflation that we saw was, again, sort of a global phenomenon that we saw because of disruptions of the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. Democrats could argue, and sometimes tried to, that, the Biden administration managed global inflation better than many of these other countries did, but it could have been worse is not a good reelection campaign slogan. But I think that additionally there was, we went through a mass trauma event, and people don't really like to talk about it or grapple with that. But there was, I think, a lot of frustration with the sort of social changes that were going on in that time around 2020. I think that there was, the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and then the reaction, I think the absolute understandable horror and outpouring of emotion, but that what led to things like people calling for defunding the police, which was, pretty poisonous, I think, for a lot of these swing voters, including voters in non-white communities, which I think Democrats sort of misread the room in that sense. Takes a couple of years, but now Democrats have a really hard time. Even still, I mean, I don't think Democrats have, in any serious way, have called for defunding the police in 4 years, but they're still hearing about it. I think the same with some of the other sort of maybe more social issues that Trump and the Republicans were able to weaponize against them. This was not what Democrats were running on in 2024, but I think it was an after effect of some of the more liberal social outpouring that we saw really come together around this very fluid, volatile time of 2020. So I think in some ways, the Dobbs decision in 2022, which was such an asteroid, spared Democrats in 2022, I think, from maybe having that immediate 2020, we're mad about the pandemic reaction, but like it came back. And I think that a lot of these, whether you're talking about economy or social issue, or the fact that you are seeing this migration of non-white working class voters, I mean, who are the voters whose livelihoods were so affected by COVID shutdowns? I mean, these are not they're not the voters who can be working from home, college educated voters who just are on Zoom all day. I mean, we were okay. But if you were shutting down businesses, or if construction ground to a halt, that's, people are going to remember that, and their livelihoods were affected. And it doesn't, you can say that we're back on track, but people still feel it in their bank accounts, and they still feel it viscerally in their in their gut, that was a time when they were out of work. And whether you can say that that was the right sort of decision for public health or not, and Lord knows that we should give people a lot of grace for trying to make sense of a very scary pandemic at that time, people were still out of work, and they were affected economically, and Democrats got punished for that this time around.
Great. I maybe regret not saying that part of what was happening in Nevada is the entire economy was shut down for 8 months. And so people lost massive amounts of money. And it's a place that runs on tourism. And it took a really long time for tourism to come back. But then even when tourism came back, it's not back in the same way. And technology has changed gigantically from now between 2020 and 2024. The night of the election, I was in the Aria Hotel, which is a very fancy schmancy hotel on the Strip, and I go to get my food for dinner, and I'm ordering from the robot. And I'm realizing, like, nobody is employed in this giant food court of 6 fancy restaurants where I paid $50 for ramen soup. I'm doing it through a robot. I mean, so like there's so many ripple effects. And the other thing I would just add about the pandemic, I mentioned distrust and cynicism of institutions. That came up constantly. And I am not a public health expert. You can debate all of the things that you want to debate about what was right or wrong to do during COVID. But it did not, no matter what you think, the time did not increase anybody's trust in institutions.
Well, and it's funny, Democrats were in the position of telling people that things aren't as bad as like, the stock market is great and unemployment is low, all of which is true. And it makes me think about a time one of my daughters was like driving with my mother-in-law, who I love dearly. This isn't to slam my mother-in-law, but she's putting down the window, and my mother-in-law said, what are you doing? She said, I'm hot. My mother-in-law rose up, she said, no, you're not. Right? So it's like you can tell people, well, the economy's great, but that was not the lived and the felt experience of a lot of people.
Right. I mean, I think in talking to some voters, and particularly in Nevada and Arizona, it came across as condescending. Say, oh, the Democrats are saying things are peachy, and like, yet I struggle to put gas in my tank. I struggle to get food on the table. So I think there was like a fundamental disconnect between Democratic messaging and how voters were feeling about the economy.
So and I know the answer to this, but I guess I want to know culturally why. Dobbs was going to be the savior of this campaign. It was going to save Joe Biden. It was the reproductive rights and women. The gender gap was going to be at all-time high. It was going to be the biggest gender gap in the history of American politics. That was going to be the demographic that was going to save the Democrats. Why, if it didn't, why wasn't a more significant factor?
You want to go first?
Yes. Two things. Steve and I have had this conversation before, so apologies that Seema's had to hear it. But I think in some ways Democrats made a error in giving voters the option to choose protecting abortion rights and voting for a different candidate. In a lot of these states where they place, like Arizona, for example, enshrining abortion rights into the state constitution, it gave voters the ability to kind of have their cake and eat it too. Because if they were, let's say that they were frustrated, they were mad about the Dobbs decision, they were worried about reproductive rights, but they also were mad about prices. If you had the ability to vote for an abortion-related issue separately on the ballot, then you could like check that box and be like, I did it, I protected abortion rights, and now I'm going to show my anger elsewhere. And I think and we saw that, by the way, in 2022 when California when they put Prop 1 on the ballot, which enshrined abortion rights in California's constitution, and yet they lost all of their toss-up House races. It wasn't translating. And I think that The other thing is like, look, Donald Trump is just, he has some magic formula where he can say things, and voters, I don't know if they're taking him seriously or not, literally not seriously. However they're taking him, it is in a way that often benefits him. And he said, I'm not going to sign a national abortion ban. And I think that that was like, voters, at least some voters heard that and were like, all right, good enough for me. And yes, I'm sure that Democrats would argue, but he put the Supreme Court justices on, and like, fine. But I think if, look, in some, and I had heard this from certain voters, particularly if they're not following every twist, twist of the screw when it comes to politics. Well, but Roe was overturned under Joe Biden. It was during the Biden administration. Oh, yeah. It's like, well, yes, that is true, but there, I mean, so I think a lot of this is Democrats, I think, thought that if they could just get these voters to listen to their argument, like they have a better argument. But if it took a couple of sentences and a back and forth to get there, I think people were already tuning out. And again, there's nothing more urgent than people's pocketbook issues. And at the end of the day, I just think that overran it.
We also think like in 2022, this was really fresh. Like it just happened. It was more top of mind. But I mean, and obviously there are some horrible stories across the country. I think ProPublica has done some stories about women who literally died because they couldn't access reproductive health care. However, I think that there is a large segment of suburban women, in various places around the country who are like, okay, the sky hasn't fallen. And while a lot of women have lost access to abortion, there's a lot of women who haven't. So I think, I just don't think that it resonated as much I think 2022, it just felt more raw. While this time around, you heard about the economy more than you did about reproductive rights.
Can I just go back to what Melanie said about on the ballot measures? I was in Arizona with a group of people who were pushing for the ballot measure there, knocking on doors. And these are women, and writing postcards and doing all the campaign for the ballot measure. All of those women were voting for Democrats, were hardcore Harris supporters. They did not talk about Democrats or Harris at the door. Goes back to what Lorena Gonzalez said. That was a conscious decision, and that was true in Arizona, and that was true in Nevada, and that was true in, I believe, in every other state that had an abortion ballot measure. The people campaigning for it did not make it a party issue. They knew, whether they would admit this on the record, very publicly at the time or not, they knew there was a distinction to be made and that they had a better shot if they left party politics out of it.
We have a very long interregnum period here in the United States. And I think it's fair to say that the way Americans, at least half of Americans, are feeling after the 2024 election is very different than the way they were feeling after the 2016 election. And it feels, at least for the moment, that perhaps it's because Donald Trump won the popular vote, perhaps because he kind of swept the board with the swing states. It feels like the opposition is either fatigued, defeated, something, but it's different. And what I want to know, because you guys are talking to so many different voter groups and writing and analyzing, do you believe once a lot of this stuff becomes more existential and real after January 21st, after Donald Trump is sworn in, that we will see a resurgence of these voters, or has something forever shifted in the electorate?
I learned a lot from my competitors, my colleagues. I don't make predictions.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, without making predictions, I mean, when things become less abstract, when, and again, I'm kind of groping down this dark hallway, as you can tell, when, the kid who your kid used to play with is rounded up and deported, will that resonate with people? If avian flu takes over and you go to Trader Joe's and there are no eggs on the shelf, will people be pissed off? Yeah. I mean, again, and I'm not going to check my phone, but I did a column and I would look at the number, but I'm going to do this off the top of my head, so indulge if I get it wrong. But, from like 80 to 80, whatever, there was like, 2 or 3 change elections and on and on and on. The point being, since the beginning of this century, we've had like 12, right? It used to be like 1 or 2 every 20 years. We've had 12. And it goes back to what I guess Mel was saying. I mean, it's just like the Republicans they're gonna own the whole thing, even though they have a very, very tenuous majority in the House. They own the whole thing part and parcel. And I just, again, I mean, I will say everything I thought I knew about politics. It seems the longer I do this, the less I know and understand. I mean, I'm telling you, I've done this for a really long time. You could tell. I have maybe more hair than you, but it's all gray at this point. Done this for a long time, and I feel like the longer I do, the less I know. But I would think that if things don't get better, I mean, I think people fundamentally voted for 2 things. They wanted inflation to go away, and they want the border to be secure. If inflation does not go away, if there is a perception that maybe some of these border remedies are going too far, will there be a backlash? I mean, we would think so, maybe.
But I think, I mean, I'm not making predictions, but I think if we know from Trump's history, from recent history, part of it is the fireworks, is the throwing a grenade and sort of watching the chaos unfold. Like, my question is, what if he may not deport the kid from your kid's soccer team? He may just do some weird thing that we can't conceive of to make a lot of noise, and then what's the reaction?
Right. Yeah. If it's just a lot of bluster, right, as opposed to and Trump has shown himself very facile at taking credit for things that happen. Right. The sun came up this morning. Well, I was in the White House when the sun came up, so so he's very facile at that. And you're right. This may just be a whole lot of bluster that doesn't translate into those things that people feel in their daily life.
I do think a key difference between the 2016 sort of resistance reaction and where we are now is Trump won the popular vote this time. And yes, to Mark's point, it was a narrow win, but it has more legitimacy. It feels more legitimate than in 2016, where there was this real departure from where the popular vote was versus these handful of battleground states. And so I think, at least talking to Democratic officials here in California, where even despite their successes in these House races, there was a pronounced conservative or red shift, whether that was because there were more people actually voting Republican, which yes happened, and then there was also a lot of people just not voting, all of which just led to bad news for the Democrats in California. I talked to former Speaker Anthony Rendon, who wrote after 2016, like the night that Trump won, he wrote this like very florid like declaration of resistance, and like California will be the protector of the nation's values. And it was like, I mean, even now he's like, this was totally over the top. And so I called him a couple weeks ago because I had to write this thing kind of about the Resistance 2.0 and sort of why the vibes are different. And what he said, which I didn't put in Playbook, but it was last time it was sociological, meaning you were like looking at these like other Trump voters. And he goes, this time it's psychological. Like we are all part of this now. And I think because of that, there's a lot less sort of like ginned up to fight, because it's like, who are you fighting? Like clearly Trump had increased his appeal. And I think that particularly in blue states where New York is another one, New Jersey's another one where, yes, there wasn't really a robust Harris campaign, and so that's why maybe the shifts were more pronounced than they were in the battleground states. But I think that there's a lot of come to Jesus going on right now in these blue states that are dominated by Democrats. Of like, our voters are not happy. They put up this guy that we think is repugnant, and these voters were like, well, but we're really pissed at you guys who are in charge. And so I do think that while there will inevitably be, if there is more than bluster, but like actual actions that are precipitate, like causing reaction, like we will see that for sure. I think that if you see the National Guard marching into California and like clearing out agricultural fields, like there's going to be reactions to that. But I also think that there is a lot of like, we got to clean up our own house, because our voters were telling us that they're not happy and they were unhappy enough to go to this guy. And balancing that, I think, is the big question for Democrats.
I think in California we saw that not just. I mean, obviously Kamala Harris won California, but if we look at Gascon, getting voted out. If we look at the proposition that changed penalties. The ballot measure, I'm sorry. So we did see voters in California, in liberal blue California, going sort of the opposite way. And also, in terms of the popular vote, and we all know, I mean, I think we largely know the president-elect wanted to win the popular vote, I think, as an ego thing. But his campaign actually this time was much more organized, and they actually, I think they worked to, Trump is never going to win California, but California is home to the most registered Republicans of any state in the nation. There are millions here, so they were able to run up the numbers in places like California and New York, even though he was never going to win the states. But then to give him that quote unquote mandate.
I was just going to say too, the F word you used, fatigue. I think, Mel was talking about sort of the professional class, if you will, normal people, as I call them, or voters. I think there's a lot of fatigue out there. I mean, I can just tell you anecdotally how many people have, the people who are like, marching and getting their pussy hats out and all that stuff. I've heard people say, you know what, I'm just not, I'm like maybe once a day, kind of like skimming the headlines. People are just tired. People are just tired. They're just, as you said, fatigued.
Yeah.
I'm going to use my favorite word of the morning, which is distrust and cynicism, a favorite phrase of the morning. And I think that just runs so deep in both among Trump voters and people who voted for Harris. Just like it's even deeper. It's fatigue, but even worse, I think. Like it goes even deeper and it's harder to come back from. And we're in a university, and you all are I'm kind of just assuming, extremely educated people who are taking time to come listen to this on a Friday morning. Like, what do we do? I mean, I think about this from my job all the time. Like, how do I increase? I'm just me, but like, what can I possibly do to increase trust in the New York Times? What can I possibly do to sort of combat cynicism? Like, it's a really big existential problem. And I know, democracy depends on that.
So we have a history in this state of a one-time U.S. senator becoming a vice president, running for president and losing, and coming back to run for governor. In fact, he was from Orange County, I think. His name was Richard Nixon. I want to talk about Kamala Harris for a little bit. Does Kamala Harris come back and run for governor, or? Yeah?
Is that a request or a prediction?
Yeah. What does Kamala do? Mark, why don't you start with Mark?
Well, yeah, so I can punt it to others because I honestly have no clue. I don't know what she would do. I don't know if she would see it as a step down. I don't know if it's a job I mean, you can tell I'm just kind of riffing. I don't know if it's a job that she's wanted. It's not like something that she's coveted her whole life. Like, I go back to Dianne Feinstein. I would just say, I think one of the most selfless acts I ever saw in my many decades of covering politics was in 2003 when the recall came around. She probably could have waltzed into a job, which was her dream job. She spent her whole life, really, not her whole life, but her whole career really coveting the job of California governor, and had an opportunity. If she had stepped in, she probably would have cleared the field. She probably would have elected governor. To me, it was one of the most selfless acts I ever saw because she didn't do it because she was opposed to the recall in principle. I don't know that Kamala Harris really has hankered for that job. I mean, there was that opening, and she ended up going for the Senate instead. So I don't know. Kind of a long-winded punt, but I'm punting.
No, but that's exactly right. I mean, there's, we get various versions of this history of what happened, but there was a moment when Senator Boxer said she was retiring, and Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris sort of stared at each other, of like and whether it was a deal or whether it was she made the decision and he followed, and there's lots of like kind of revisionist history around that. But the truth is that her eye was on the Senate so that she can run for president. That was, and if she wanted to run for governor, she probably could have decided to do that instead. I mean, my colleagues, Chris Catalogo and Eugene Daniels, had a story on this about a week and a half ago, where the most interesting detail that they had was that they were hearing that she may not come back to California, that she might be setting, like in the immediate aftermath, actually might be staying on the East Coast, maybe even setting up shop in New York, which I thought was an interesting kind of twist. If she's not coming back to California, then she's not running for governor in California. I was up in Sacramento talking to people who know her very well, or have, and it was kind of a split. I think the people who my reflection is the people who sort of know her best are the most doubtful. The people who know her sort of a little bit more like tangentially think that that's more likely. I do think that it is that if she chose to do it, the idea that she would clear the field, at least among Democrats, I think is pretty persuasive. But to Mark's point about her running a good campaign, I agree. I think she ran, for the most part, a pretty good campaign in some pretty difficult circumstances, but it was also the best possible campaign circumstances in a different way that would have fit her, which is that it was very short and compressed. And for those of us who had followed her presidential campaign in 2019, we can tell you that's not a long campaign is not necessarily her forte. And so I don't know if she wants to campaign for a year and a half to run for governor. But
I
you
mean,
know,
I don't think she has to do it for a year and a half, quite frankly. I mean,
but it's
because
not 2 months.
no, it's not 2 months. Certainly not 2 months. But I think she has more time if she decides to do it. I think she can wait longer because she'll have the money, she'll have the backing. I mean, she has. If she jumps in the field, it'll have an immediate impact because most Californians don't know who most of who the people running for governor are. So I think she has more time than you would normally have to make a decision.
By the way, what I know Nixon ran, he lost, and then what happened?
He went to New York to plot his comeback.
Oh, okay.
Just throw that out there. Just saying. Is there anything that the Democrats could have done differently to have won this race? There was a big discussion about if had Biden stayed in. Okay, we can answer that one probably pretty quickly. If there had been an open primary process and selected a nomination, the short convention that the kind of the pod bros were kind of throwing out there for a while. Is there a different issue set that Kamala could have taken on that would have changed the outcome of the race? Anything?
Sure. If inflation hadn't gone through the roof, if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine, I mean, yeah, it's really hard. I don't know of an issue set or I mean, to answer your question, I can't think of anything offhand.
I mean, as much as I don't want to make predictions, I also really don't want a Monday morning quarterback. I've never ran a campaign since high school student government.
How'd that go?
I won.
Okay.
I was the vice president and the editor of the newspaper, so some ethics
A little
committee should
conflict
have
of
gone.
interest there, right?
Distrust an institution.
Collusion.
Medina.
That sounds.
I hadn't learned ethics at the time. How we do it in Riverside. But in all, I really don't know that I have some. I don't think this is a tactical thing. But two things that come to mind are listening to people. I mean, I'm really struck, at the risk of sounding Pollyannish or naive, I am really struck how few things like town halls happen anymore. How little give and take there is between politicians and the people who they are asking for their votes. So that's one. My other hot take is that policy matters. Like, we love in the media to say, oh, voters don't care about policy. I think that's wrong. I think people really do care about, like, what is the government actually doing? And it's not breaking news to say that Congress isn't the most effective institution we have right now.
I would agree with that, but I would say that if there was one thing that Democrats can, I think Democrats take the practice of putting together policy very seriously. I think they come up short when it comes to selling those policies. And I think even things like the Inflation Reduction Act, I think that there were a lot of elements in there, either the Inflation Reduction Act or in the Infrastructure Act, that were like very explicitly geared towards helping out union labor. And yet we saw they didn't then sort of connect the dots or be able to convince union members in a lot of states, like, this, we helped you, we did this. And I think that there is, I do think that sometimes there's a disconnect between the policy wonks in the Democratic Party and then the ones who are actually, and even just things like, when are the deliverables going to come through? I mean, look, Donald Trump put his name on checks.
Right, but they're not there yet. They aren't in people's
Right, exactly. So it's like,
hands.
I think to sort of like agree with you and add on to it, policy matters, and you better deliver policy in time for an election. And I do think that the Democrats kind of came up short for that. And the other point, which I 100% agree with, when it comes to listening to people, the Democratic Party did not want to listen to the fact that voters were telling them that Joe Biden was too old to run for president again. Your colleague, Ested Herndon, did a great job on his podcast, The Run Up, for a year and a half, saying, and to anyone who would listen, like, people think he's too old. People think he's too old. And I would watch, he would say that, and then, like, Democratic Twitter would just, like, the pile-ons that he would get, because it was like there was some collective decision among, I think, the Democratic Party leaders, and then the most ardent sort of, like, hardcore Democratic-based voters, which is just like, this is our guy, and we're sticking to it. And they did not listen to the thing that voters were screaming at them for a long time.
Well, and I
For,
think
wait, for, can I, sorry, point of privilege, because
Yeah.
Melanie made a joke about timestamp. I love Ested, he's a dear friend. My colleague Reed and I wrote that story in, I believe, January 2023, or maybe it was 2022.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that people thought, that regular voters that thought that Biden was going to be a bridge candidate, as he described himself, was so obvious and pervasive, and they chose to ignore that. And that's a choice.
Well, and I think someone, I can't remember, maybe it was Melanie, who mentioned that the seeds were kind of sown in the midterm, right? I mean, the Democrats did way, I mean, look, if they had gotten their butts kicked the way Clinton got his butt kicked in 94 and began triangulating, or Barack Obama got his butt kicked in 2010, but Democrats were like, wow, you know, we did way better than we thought, so I guess maybe we won't, to use a expression, you know, switch horses, you know, and to sort of argue like a politician on both sides. I mean, you know, I could see a scenario where Democrats had a primary and they would have come out with someone who obviously was not Biden or Harris. But what would they have done or said in the course of the campaign to get that nomination? I mean, remember, so much of what was used to paint Kamala Harris as out of touch goes back to positions she took going very, very far left, which is interesting. I wrote a column to this effect. I mean, the thing that Kamala did was not in her nature. Never was, never has been a lefty, but played one on television so she could win the nomination in 2020. It came back to haunt her. So yes, I could see, you know, not being Biden, not being Harris might have been something that Democrats could have run on to separate themselves from the incumbent administration. But again, who knows what positions they might have taken in that primary that would then have been wrapped around their necks.
Well, then also to Melanie's point earlier, I mean, there were so many headwinds against, I think, the Democratic Party, you know, particularly because of the economic issues. And then to Mark's point, you know, some of the social issues that Kamala Harris took previously. I mean, every NFL game on a Sunday, you saw that ad, you know, with her with I think it was with the drag queen, but and I mean, obviously in California, like most people here don't care about that, but that I think that resonated, particularly when Republicans were also making an argument to suburban women that, you know, you might be cool with like LGBTQ issues, but you don't want your children to be able to, you know, change their name or gender in school and you not know about it. So I think there's a dividing line here. You know, I mean, I have my personal opinions about it, but I just remember every NFL game on Sunday seeing that ad.
And that tag, I would just say very quickly, you know, setting aside whatever you might think in terms of effectiveness, that tagline, she's for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. I think that was the single most effective.
Right, but it was the
sentence
second
of
part,
hope.
the Donald Trump was for you, that was, I mean, like the they them thing was like, but it was the setup, but the knockout punch was the Donald Trump.
It was a
Exactly.
great. I mean, it was a
It
very
worked,
effective ad.
just to note, it worked in Spanish too. Even though they can't translate, there's no real translation for they, them in Spanish. They didn't need it.
Right.
They said in Spanish, Kamala Harris is for them, Donald Trump is for us.
I think you can all see why I enjoy most of my days talking to these reporters, working on stories. Thank you. Big round of applause for our panelists today. And we're going to go ahead and exit stage right, I think that is, and reintroduce Dean Gould to be back up to the podium.
Of all of this, saying that this was the single best post-election discussion that you have seen nationwide. So I want to thank the panel very much for this. All right, if I could call up our second group of panelists, and while we do that, we're going to swap out the water for you. To give you a sense of how the rest of the morning is going to go, we have a panel now where we are going to be talking about the numbers, what the numbers show, and then after that, we will be having Congresswoman Katie Porter and Mayor O'Neill from Newport Beach in conversation. So stay with us. If you need a quick cup of coffee, please go get one. But let's bring our next panel up on the stage, please. So we have a substitute, Dan Schnurr, who I have known for years and can talk about anything but especially elections, will be joining us. But let me turn this over to our moderator. It is not often that I get to meet a Pulitzer Prize winner. It is even rarer that I get to meet someone who's not only won the Pulitzer Prize, but has also been a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize, and that is our moderator, Laura Nelson. She's a reporter with the Los Angeles Times covering California politics. When I mentioned the Pulitzer Prize, she was on a team of journalists that won that in 2016 for the coverage of the San Bernardino terror attack. She was also a finalist in 2020 for her coverage of a deadly diving boat fire near Santa Barbara. On top of all of that, she is a native Kansan, which in my family means a lot. So, Laura, I am going to turn it over to you to introduce the panel and to take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I don't know how we're going to follow that amazing first panel, but we will do our best. I'm going to take a leaf out of Mike's book and let you read everyone's bios yourselves because we have a lot to get through in a very short amount of time. But I'd just like to say two special notes. First, it's so great to have Dan here. He was my political science professor when I was at USC. It's very exciting to be back together on the same stage, and he always takes my calls, which I like to think is because I learned from him at one time and still do. And also, Marva, it's so nice to have you here. Target Book is a tool that every political journalist truly cannot live without. It is a really wonderful asset.
Music to my ears.
I'm really glad to have all four of you here. First panel really touched on kind of what was happening nationally. I'm hoping we can kind of hone in on California and specifically Orange County because there is so much to talk about in this great state. But I'm going to let each of you just kind of kick it off with your opening thoughts about what happened in the Golden State, both presidentially and down ballot races, congressional and legislative races as well. Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start since you haven't heard enough of from me yet. Look, California is always a fascinating place, and I'm going to drill down a little bit more specifically to Orange County because one is being a fellow here at UC Irvine. The reason why I was excited about coming down to Orange County is because of what Dean Gould mentioned earlier, which is it's this sort of perfect petri dish to help us understand what is happening at a time of really significant transformation in our politics. Orange County has some great anomalies and some great, interesting dynamics. I think it's being able to just go from Santa Ana, for example, heavily Latino city, where you're starting to see this rightward shift that we're seeing nationally, and then going next door to Westminster and to Vietnamese communities, where you're seeing longtime Republicanism starts to fade generationally towards the left. There's phenomenal stories of sort of assimilation and changing ethnic understanding is really, I think, remarkable. And so it's exciting to kind of be at the front lines of watching all of that transformation and change happen. A couple things that I think are particularly interesting, and I think we need to take into a little bit more study, are the fact that three of these three swing seats in Orange County, all represented by Asian American voters, which I think is going to tell us a lot about college education attainment levels, especially with non-white voters, as those numbers increase and explode. It's as a county, this is one of the top counties with the highest percentage of non-college educated, non-white college educated voters. UC Irvine, as I understand, has the highest diversity of any racial and ethnic diversity of any UC campus. And that, I think, is a sign of what the future looks like as the diploma divide continues to reshape the contours of American politics. The fact that Steve Garvey wins the race or in Orange County as the top vote getter, at the same time Kamala Harris is, I think speaks to these really peculiar anomalies with very methodological voting, very specific vote and ticket splitting, as we mentioned a little bit on the first panel. In 2016, I'll give you a really good example. In 2016, when Donald Trump first ran, we saw something we had never seen before in Orange County. We didn't even have a name for it in politics, which is there were more votes down ticket House Republicans than there were at the top of the ticket. A lot of Republican voters just would not vote for Donald Trump and skipped it altogether. It's very common to have what we call an undervote, which means people will vote for the top of the ticket and then not vote down ticket. We had the reverse of that with Republicans here. In 2018, those same precincts that showed that dynamic all switched and voted for the Democrat. And for the first time, you'll recall in that year, big Democratic year, there was not a single Republican member of Congress in the county. In 2020, Sorry, this is kind of what political nerds do. But in 2020, that split, again, Republicans picked up House seats, even though Joe Biden won the county. All of this is telling us that even in the counties, the battleground districts that you're looking at here in the county, there's a lot more attention being paid to voting behavior strategically. It's clearly not ideological. It's very much, I believe, voting against that party in power, voting to vote for divided government. And I think that we're going to continue to see that type of voting behavior, especially in counties like this. Real quickly, I know we're going to talk about some of the other House seats and stuff, and I'm sure Marva specifically will get into these details. I don't believe that turnout is benefiting Democrats the way that it used to. This is a larger dynamic that has been happening nationally for the better part of a decade. California, in many ways, I think this is one of the great ironies of California at this moment in time, is actually an outlier in a lot of these trends. It's been behind the times, where California has always valued itself as being a front runner of change and the preview of coming attractions of all things political. With the largest ethnic demographic transformation in this country's history, California is behind the times. We're seeing this happen in virtually every other one of the 49 states. Here it's happening last and later. We can get into why. But seats like Adam Gray's against John Duarte, this last seat that was called, that should have been a 4 or 5 point seat in a presidential year. It would have been 8 to 10 years ago. Now it's coming down to a couple of hundred votes and will be very contentious going forward. David Valadao, the largest Mexican-American seat represented by a Republican in Congress. Valadao wins quite handily in a seat that should have been much more competitive. These are all signs that the changing nature of the parties has now come to California also, and I think it portends a very significant change in the next 30 years of what California is going to look like. I think it will be very different than what we saw over the last 30 years.
We're going to talk about each of those House races, I hope, a little bit more, because they're all fascinating in their own special ways. But Dan, let's go to you next.
I can't believe I have to follow Mike Madrid. So first of all, I want to thank you all for having me here today. And for the record, I am incredibly proud of my former student, Laura Nelson. And I was incredibly proud of her before her Pulitzer Prizes, plural. And for the record, I take her calls not because we worked together at USC several years ago, but because she's an amazingly talented reporter. I will also say that I met Mike Madrid right after he finished his graduate thesis at Georgetown University on why Republicans should devote more time and effort to reaching out to Republican voters, and then was ignored for the next quarter century. And I met Dean Gould when he was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, so I am feeling really, really old today. There's a wonderful quote from Wallace Stegner. He said, "California is America, only more so." And it appeals to both our diversity and our egomania in really helpful ways. So I think when we talk about Orange County, which John has correctly identified as the new swing county in American politics, when we talk about Orange County, when we talk about even deep blue California, we are talking about the United States of America. And Mike made a brief reference, and this came up very briefly as well in the first panel. He spoke very briefly about the diploma divide. And I think as we talk about this election, nationally, state, and locally, it's critically important for us to remember that the voters who delivered the White House to Donald Trump were working class male voters. Now, working class, of course, is the polite term that we use in society today for people who didn't go to college. And the data, and we can get into it later, should you care to, between those who have high school diplomas and have college diplomas in terms of their votes in this election was an extraordinary differential, particularly among young men. And as Mike knows more about than just about anyone in the country, not just young white men, but young men of every racial and ethnic background. And there's another old saying, and I would attribute the person who said it, except I don't know who it was. So as Dan Schnur once said, culture eats politics for breakfast. Politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. Politics is the result of the cultural and social and societal experiences that every one of us has every day. And so what I'd like to do with my remaining time is share with you a few statistics that have nothing to do with politics, and therefore everything to do with politics. So when we think about this diploma gap in American politics, when we talk about the shift in American politics from a 20th century dynamic where income was the most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior to a 21st century dynamic where religiosity and urban or rural standing and education have become the great dividers in our politics, these are the reasons why. One, the average high school graduate will earn about $1 million less over their lifetime than the average four-year college graduate. Two, the average person without a four-year college degree lives about 8 years less than the average four-year college grad. Three, 35% of high school graduates are obese, compared with 25% of four-year college grads. Four, high school grads are much less likely to get married, and women with high school degrees are twice as likely to divorce within 10 years of marrying as women with college degrees. Five, nearly 60% of births to women with a high school degree or less happen out of wedlock. That's roughly 5 times higher than the rate for women with at least a bachelor's degree. Six, the opioid death rate for those with a high school degree is about 10 times higher than those with a bachelor degree. And now these trends become even more intense when you break them down by gender. We know that young women are much more likely to attend college and to graduate from college than young men. We know that their earning potential, therefore, in their 20s and 30s is much higher than young men. And we know, consequently, that social pathologies like alcoholism and drug abuse and suicide attempts are much higher among young men than young women. And non-college educated Americans, therefore, and understandably, especially young working class men, they're resentful, they're angry. And Donald Trump taps into those frustrations and those resentments more effectively than almost any other politician in American politics. And I offer that as neither a compliment nor a criticism of the president-elect. I will say, and probably guarantee everyone in this room to be mad at me on one side or the other, the only American politician I think who is nearly as good at tapping into those resentments is Donald Trump, is probably Bernie Sanders. And they reach out to different cohorts, different segments of the electorate with equal effectiveness. But that anger and that resentment is understandable and it's palpable. And Trump has been able to, on issues like the border, on issues like criminal justice, and most effectively on issues like inflation, tap into those issues in a way I think that drove the election outcomes at every level of our politics in last month's election.
The stakes are growing with each speaker because the points are so intelligent. All right, Marva, what can you add to that?
I'm going to go a little bit of a different route on this. I think there have been changes in the Democratic Party. I'm going to take it from that point of view. There have been changes in the Democratic Party over the last 20 years that aren't publicized, aren't talked about really widely. In fact, other consultants that I work with, if they don't specialize on working on Democratic Party issues internally, they may not know the changes are happening because they happen so slowly and over time. But when I was a very young baby staffer, the Democratic Party was set up so that a whole host of decisions were made on a very wide scale with a number of different caucuses having input. And a lot of those caucuses were quote unquote controlled by labor, whether they were building trades, teachers, whatnot, across the board. Over time, the bylaws have changed for the party in California, and most recommendations now go through one single caucus. And if you watch where the money is coming from, most of those dollars, over 80% of those dollars, are trial attorneys. So if you think about it through that point of view and that lens, they are very wealthy individuals that are spending time in politics to benefit themselves, and that percolates then through everything else. And for me, I work largely on state legislative races, but those then talking points that are coming down from the party and mandated don't resonate with the average voter. So what I found fascinating in this cycle in particular, because I've been working on state legislative races, this is my 29th year in state California politics, I was having debates. I won't call them fights. My nickname used to be Bulldog, but I won't call them fights. I was having debates on messaging and word choice in polls and pushing back on what we wanted to ask on focus groups because they wanted to talk about choice and they wanted to talk about choice and they wanted to talk about choice. And I kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm a single mom with 2 teenage boys, and to feed them, I'm gonna have to sell a kidney. Like, there's just no way I can afford everything that's coming down. And I do pretty good. I have 2 businesses, right? So I'm not complaining, but I'm like, people are struggling, right? Gas is expensive, groceries are expensive. And those debates with those party officials were, I had to be pretty, I won't, you know me, I had to be pretty forceful and conniving to get my way. And I got my way in my races that I cared about, but I know that other people that aren't as evil as me did not get their way. 2, tactics. I participate in polling and focus groups in other states only on occasion when they're my friend because I don't like doing work in other states. I'm too old. But in other states, political consultants have evolved with the time and they use tactics that make sense in communicating with their voters. In California, I'm going to get burned for this, so Mike, don't tell people in Sacramento. In California, the consultants are so used to doing mail for financial reasons, and it's easier. But the voter database, the mailing list, has been denigrated. So in most locations, it can be as low as 40% accurate to 70% accurate. That's not great. So you're missing a whole host of people you're talking to when you only rely on mail. Where's the digital ads? Getting that paid for, right? Like it's just a whole boondoggle. And then in California, we have the added problem with the privacy concerns in cookies, right? So unless you're investing with a digital advocacy firm, which can get around cookies, you're advertising to masses you don't even want to talk to on the tactics side. So getting the accurate message out is hard in California. 3rd, Latina voters, I definitely want to talk about. When I was younger, my parents are both scientists. My first to go to college in our family. My dad has a PhD, my mom has 2 masters, grew up in San Jose. I remember when Prop 187 was on the ballot, and it was a commercial came on, and it was during Scooby-Doo, and it had ants invading a picnic, and then it morphed into people crossing the border. And my mom was crying, and my dad was trying to comfort her. And I'll be honest, my parents, they were always worked polls, were very engaged in politics. They became Democrats. They were not Democrats before. And when I was actually 17 working, don't laugh, but I was working on the Ross Perot campaign at 17. I loved that guy. And I convinced my mom to vote for Ross Perot for me. But I remember asking her, like, okay, what party are we again? And she said, we're Democrats. The Republicans don't want us. So it wasn't that we chose to be Democrats, it was that the Republicans didn't want us. And my parents now, 86 and 82, this was the first year, and they're on a fixed income, thought about, my mom hates Trump, like I can't put big capital letters enough, hates him, but they considered voting for him because they thought their money, their dollar could go further in their last years. They ended up not voting for him. They voted for Kamala. But I think that that whole generation of voters that voted Democrat because the Republicans didn't want us are getting older. And I think everybody else that we're, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, we are struggling. And there's no reason that we can remember in general why we're not Republicans. So I think we're more open to the conversation and different messages.
It's really interesting. We're going to come back to Latino voters, especially when we talk about the Central Valley, which is very interesting. A couple races there, but Ken, we'll end with you before we jump in on more detail.
So I guess paraphrasing Kamala Harris, I would not change a single thing of what my previous 3 panelists said. my old and good friend, the dean, John Gould, identified this initiative that he was going to take and try and, build a school a little bit on this fact that Orange County was and is a purple county and a very important place and a very interesting place. So as we say in Washington, D.C., that all has the added benefit of being true. And this, if I was a young graduate student, if I was trying to understand the big forces that are at work in American politics, I would hang out here a lot. And I think also one of the things you're hearing here, we all approach this from a variety of different approaches. And I would hang out in this place a lot, not only to do the sorts of big N quantitative surveys I do, but to talk to normal people, as well. But let me talk a little bit about the survey that I helped work on that just came out today. So John doesn't put his thumb on the results, but political scientists are really brilliant. And we spent all of this money doing all of this research, and we've determined that Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans. That's our big variable. So one of the first things you want to look at, and I think Mark talked about, Dave Winston talking about this, what's the composition of the electorate? And if we were all sitting here at a panel post-2012, you know what everyone would have been talking about? A permanent Democratic majority, because permanent means forever, but then they would have reiterated that. A permanent Democratic majority forever, right? It was +6 or +7 D nationally, more in California. Probably Orange County was probably plus something D back then. And it was, old people were going to die, young people were more Democratic, the non-white electorate, and it was just going to be completely baked in. The country, and this is sort of like, for those of you who've done national politics, Republicans were winning races in this country, but Democrats always had the advantage in partisanship and party ID. In this national election, Republicans had a +4 or +5 advantage in the composition of the electorate. And then you use that brilliant political scientist that Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans. There were more Republicans. In Orange County, absolutely even. And that sort of explains, right, why Harris lost by a little bit nationally. She won by a little bit here. The fact that this place is even and makes it a little bit more democratic than the country as a whole, just being even in terms of party composition. A county that was even in party composition would have been way to the right of the average previously. And then listen, I think in the first part, they also talked about the fundamental factors, what we saw, and maybe we didn't even talk enough about Joe Biden. Just should not have run for re-election. And for all of you reporters who had Biden folks yelling at you, if you even wrote one word about that, they would hear, oh no, the old man's running circles around us. We can barely keep up with him. I can see people rolling their eyes in front of me. He had a very high approval rating in Orange County, 40%, right? That was at the high end of what he had. And some more brilliant political science, right? 60% disapproving of the incumbent administration. Kamala Harris had to win, and also there was asymmetry in intensity. People who approved of Joe Biden only sort of approved of Joe Biden. People who disapproved of Joe Biden strongly disapproved of Joe Biden. So there was sort of this sliver of maybe 10% of the electorate who only sort of disliked Joe Biden that Kamala Harris had to try and win the election on. She didn't win him here. She didn't win him nationally, but there was just slightly more Democrats here, which allowed her to do that. Now, what was the Democratic hope? Well, Democratic Party's hope, Democratic campaign's hope, that abortion was going to be that silver bullet, that there were these party ID factors, which they knew about. They knew that they had an incumbent president who was deeply unpopular, but they were going to talk about abortion. Orange County is more pro-choice, much more pro-choice than the rest of the country. According to this recent survey, over 70% of people in Orange County are pro-choice, and only a sliver are on the most extreme of pro-life. Half of the voters, according to the survey we did, half of Donald Trump's voters were pro-choice, okay? So that did not Trump, right? I mean, it did not trump the fact that you had a deeply unpopular president and all of these cultural factors we were talking about. I think this is an interesting conversation to have on a college campus, and I didn't have to be particularly smart to read the room here when Dean Gould was doing his introduction. This is a room with a particular partisan point of view. I would really encourage you to do the things that reporters like all of you do and get out and talk to real people. The anger about COVID, the anger about elitism is profound. This probably isn't gonna help. Maybe on the next poll we'll ask it. But as I was thinking as people were talking about COVID, and many of you may have lost friends, family members, so I don't want this to sound, snarky, but, for most people like us, COVID was fine. It was sort of fun. Managed to get a Peloton, had some weights at home. My wife and I hung out, ate good food. Kids were already, out. Wasn't bad. Was not a big deal. That is not someone who worked as, name the job in Las Vegas would say about COVID. And in California, that was the case. And again, it's me playing reporter. I was talking to this Uber driver, which is what everyone says, like, oh, I knew what was going to happen in 2016, right? I talked to some Uber driver. But I was talking to the Uber driver last night, coming down here. He was talking about Gavin Newsom closing the beaches and closing the skate parks. And that's still, and I hadn't heard about that. I'm like, what, skate parks? I'm from the East Coast. We don't really do that. And then as I was sitting here, listening to what the previous panel was talking about that, it's those sorts of things. We're talking about, or journalists are talking about, Democrats are talking about abortion, democracy, and these people's lives were shattered during COVID, and there's still great bitterness about it. And this was their chance to vote on that. And so I also think it's really consistent with what Dan was saying is, I always say the culture wins. The culture always wins, whether it's in an organization, in a university, or in politics. And look forward to continuing the conversation. I know we're going to talk about a little bit about Latinos, because in terms of what's happening with non-white voters and what's happening with non-college educated voters, both in our survey and in this county, this is a fascinating place to look at those issues.
A perfect segue. We are going to delve now a little into Orange County because it's where we are, and also because I think it's one of the most interesting places politically in the state right now. I think Melanie, maybe on the previous panel, alluded to this, but in this kind of like sea of red in the election map this year, there were a couple of bright spots for Democrats, specifically in California, with the House races. After sweeping in the blue wave of 2018, flipping 7 seats in the House, Democrats really were kind of on the back foot in 2020 and again in 2022. And this year managed to flip 3 seats held by pretty well-funded GOP incumbents, which is Mike Garcia in the Antelope Valley in Los Angeles County. Adam Gray, John Duarte, the Republican, was defeated by Adam Gray in the Central Valley by like a wafer-thin margin, 187 votes. And then in Orange County, as many of you probably followed most closely, Democrat Derek Tran beat... Let's hold our applause till the end, please. Democrat Derek Tran beat GOP incumbent Michelle Steele, who's very well connected. Her husband, Sean Steele, is the former chairman of the Orange County Republican Party, just like a very kind of entrenched, long-time, very well-connected, very well-funded Republican. And so many of the themes that you guys already touched on, I think, probably come to bear in Orange County specifically. Oh, and the other is that, of course, Dave Min held on to the 47th district, which, although it wasn't a flip for Democrats, was still a very important hold because they've managed to slightly shrink the GOP majority in the House. It's thinner. It will be thinner next session than it already is. So all the factors that you've touched on, I'm assuming, play a role in this. We talked a little about demographics, about education, about income, about COVID, but I'm hoping to hear from you in whatever order you'd like to do it in about what factors you think contributed to the 47th and the 45th going blue and staying blue. Anyone want to go first?
I think Marva should.
I was going to say, I'm happy to comment on the Orange County. I'll let other people jump in. I would like to actually talk about the congressional districts in the Central Valley, because one of them was Congressional District 13, which Adam Gray won.
We're going to do that one next.
And then Congressional District 22. I just know them so much better, so I'll just jump ahead and everyone else can jump in for Orange County. But those two seats, the 22, Rudy Salas was running on the Democratic side and lost pretty much by a landslide. Adam Gray won by a sliver of a margin, and I know them better only because I was Adam's chief of staff when he was in the legislature. So I followed that with, obviously helped as much as I could. But those were super interesting because, one, the high Latino voters there, right? So how do you message to them? But also, just to throw this into the mix in the conversation, what I was talking about before, party politics plays in, right? DCCC had those on their list, right? They were crucial, they were involved, lots of money went in, everything. But that messaging, again, came down from the party down the line. And if you, depending on how you structured your campaign, what you said to the voters and how you said it was dictated by the DCCC. And those messages were not necessarily what was appealing to Latino voters or to the working class voters, right? To middle class families, anybody who was struggling. And so Adam Gray, if anyone here knows the name Adam Gray, he was a Democrat in the legislature who was very familiar with the no vote, the no button, right? The red button on his desk. He did not play fairly in sandboxes. He played by his own rules. He really was a true independent. And when he ran previously for Congress, he lost by a sliver of a margin, but he learned how to push back on DCCC in that first run. And so this next round, when he was up again, he wanted it his way or nothing. And that was the deal that was cut. That's what the conversation was. So when he ran again, it really was about him on his politics for his district. And at the same time, he organized the youth, I'm glad we're talking university, he organized the students. He took 2 years to truly old school labor organized students. And I really feel like that was what put him over the edge. So there was a whole host of things that played into that. But I think on the messaging, the tactics, and the outreach for sure were crucial in those seats.
Since we're in the Central Valley, let's stay there. So these are, for those of you who aren't as familiar with these districts, they're two districts right next to each other, both in the very agricultural Central Valley. One had a Democrat who won by fewer than 200 votes, and the other, the Republican held onto his seat by like a lot. I think it was about 7 points. These districts on paper look kind of similar, but I know there's a lot of differences between the electorates. And one of them is that in David Valadao, the Republican who was easily reelected, Kern County, which is home to Bakersfield, had a huge rightward shift. It was, I think, about 19 points to the right this cycle. But Mike, you're nodding. I know this is kind of your sweet spot here.
Yeah, and I'm gonna segue into Orange County with this if I could.
We will get back to Orange County.
Yeah, because there's 3 seats I think we should actually be looking at to understand the Latino vote in California. The first is the David Valadao seat. The second is what is now the Adam Gray seat, which is Stockton area. And then the third is actually the Mike Garcia seat, which was Republican held up until last Tuesday, first Tuesday in November, when Greg Whiteside picked it up. The Democrats picked up this seat. The reason why these 3 need to be looked at is because they represent almost perfectly the distinct nature of the changing Latino vote. The David Valadao seat, which is deep in the Central Valley, is overwhelmingly agricultural, very Hispanic dense, large Democratic registration, and like you saw in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, very significant rightward shift. This is where Democrats are struggling the most. And what happened was Valadao, in a seat that I never really thought was that competitive for all these dynamics, won pretty easily. This is where the real heart of the challenge for Democrats lies. If you go drive up the 5 or the 99 a little bit north, you hit that Stockton seat, the Adam Gray, John Duarte seat, where Adam Gray just defeated John Duarte by 187 votes. This is really fascinating because half half of the Latinos in this district live in what we call Hispanic dense precincts. This is where there's large Latino communities where Democrats used to just go in and do massive get out the vote efforts and drive out as much of the turnout as they could. And high turnout was always the key. For the last 30 years, high turnout was central for Latino candidates or Democratic candidates to win if you got big Latino turnout. But what that also means is half of Latinos in that district do not live in Hispanic dense precincts. These are that suburbanized second and third generation, which is where the explosion in Latino voters is happening right now. And that's why it was so close. It was such a battleground seat, and why I think Adam Gray is gonna have a really difficult time holding that seat going forward, really difficult. Had he been a Latino Democrat, I think it'd be a lot easier, but the problem remains. So this is gonna be a very competitive seat. That takes us down to the third seat, which is Northern LA County. Mike Garcia. There are no Hispanic dense precincts in this area. A lot of the Latinos in this district look like Mike Garcia. They're second, third, fourth generation, college educated, much more affluent, higher suburbanized voters that are much more Republican-ish. And what the ish comes to what Dan was pointing out, which is this diploma divide, that much more college degreed. And what we're seeing is that college degree is becoming a much bigger indicator than ethnicity. And we're seeing that all over the place here in Orange County. The more you go to college and graduate from college, the much greater the likelihood that you're going to vote for the Democratic Party. And so the fact that Mike Garcia was even holding that seat in the first place, I thought was kind of fascinating. He won it in a special election, won 2 generals after that, just lost it now. That is a much more Democratic seat than it has been with Mike Garcia's representation. But my point is, if you want to understand the Latino vote, and as I mentioned, how it's going to be different in the next generation, the next 25 or 30 years, compared to the stereotype we built over the last 25 and 30 years, you have to understand whether it's a rural Latino seat, a suburban Latino seat, or a mix between the two. And those 3 seats give us the perfect encapsulation of what is happening with that vote at this point in time.
So I want to pick up on where Mike and Marva were on both the Central Valley and the Southern California districts that Laura asked about. And I'll start where Mike left off, where I was talking about earlier, is this extraordinary diploma divide. And whether you think about it in terms of income or lifespan or drug addiction, this is the biggest dividing line in our culture and therefore in our politics. And we spent most of the 20th century in this country, and I think Barry Back and I are the only people here who remember 20th century politics, in which the 2 parties were divided. The most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior through most of the 20th century was income, and as Mike said, race and ethnicity. In 2004, we saw for the first time religiosity, not the religious faith that you practice, but rather the intensity with which you practice it, the frequency with which you attend religious services, became the single most reliable determinant in partisan voting behavior. Add on to that the rural and urban divide, add on to that the education divide, and you see a new split forming. And to take a look at these districts, to grotesquely oversimplify, because that's what panelists do, what I would suggest to you is if you want to think about the future fight over Congress, and there's an equally interesting fight taking place on the other side of the aisle, but let's focus for a moment on the future fight for the control of the Democratic Party. And think of it, based on what we've heard from Marva and Mike, as a fight between Adam Gray and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And what they represent are 2 wings of a Democratic Party, both of whom are vital in some portions of the country. But in the suburban areas of Southern California and Ventura and Orange County, you are seeing the gray Democrats beginning to ascend. Now, Mike correctly points out that those Adam Gray Democrats, when they are Asian Pacific Islanders or Latinos, will be in an even greater position to succeed. But they are able to protect the Democratic losses that the Democrats have been suffering among non-college educated voters in a way that the traditional base of the party is not. Once again, to grotesquely oversimplify, way back in the day, they used to say there were 2 kinds of Democrats: beer drinkers and wine drinkers. And to sum up what we've heard in a panel and a half so far, in the Democratic Party, the number of wine drinkers very quickly began to outnumber the number of beer drinkers. So the beer drinkers left, and the wine drinkers realized there weren't enough of them to win. And so in order to augment the remaining wine drinkers with beer drinkers, it takes candidates who can speak to those voters, whose religious values, whose educational opportunities reflect a cohort that elected Donald Trump in this year's election. Plenty of other points here, but poor Ken is about to jump out of his chair, so I better shut up and let him go.
And then
I was actually like, so as a nonpartisan bourbon drinker, I can, so I don't want people want to know what I am. If you want to know anything about the California districts and the numbers, I mean, literally the numbers of the districts. But let me talk about, what folks were talking about with Latinos, and again, like why I think this place is so interesting. Just talking about Latino voters seems crazy to me, with the variance by age, by gender, by country of origin, and as Dan said, by education and religiosity, and also Latinos who primarily used to be Catholic. There's now a big swath of Latinos who are evangelical Christians. And if I have to know one thing about them, it's that they're evangelical Christians, which is much more important to me understanding how they're gonna vote than those other attributes. Listen, what people in politics say, if I could only know one thing, what would it be? And I don't know if it makes good TV that we're agreeing with each other, but it used to be like, if I knew your gender, if I knew your race or ethnicity, if I knew your income. Now, it's if I know your education level is sort of the single most important thing for me to understand. And that's then gonna have implications about how the parties communicate with voters, both in terms of message, and again, I'm not a complete shill for the dean saying this is why Orange County is interesting, but Orange County is also interesting because it's really expensive to do regular old television here, which by the age of this crowd, some people have heard of, not like my normal students who I talk to. But if you are going to communicate in Orange County, right? In the old world used to be mail, right? And what is the new world in a very fragmented media space and digital space?
that's actually a perfect segue back to Orange County,
Mr.
where I
Segue.
want to spend the rest of the conversation. So Derek Tran and Michelle Steele, which I think was one of the most interesting races of the entire cycle, and also one of the most expensive, which goes back to your point about the media market. Social media and in-language media became a huge part of this campaign. I don't know how many Vietnamese speakers there are in this audience. I ended up using Google Translate for Vietnamese a lot more in this election than I expected to at the beginning, but both candidates were heavily, heavily targeting voters in native languages in digital advertising, which is both more effective and a lot cheaper than going up on TV. And I'm hoping you guys can talk a little bit, whoever wants to jump in on this, about what made that race so competitive and what Derek Tran's chances look like in 2 years, whether you think this is a one-off or it represents some kind of a shift in the way this district is, if it's actually becoming more blue.
I'll jump in and talk about it a little bit because we actually did a podcast earlier this year, which was very elegantly titled Red County, Blue County, Orange County. Talking about all of these dynamics.
Is that like a brown county if you mix all this together?
Right. And so we one of the dynamics I wanted to explore was that seat and that discussion. So I sat down with Sean Steele, who I've known for 30 years, the Congresswoman's husband, because he does a lot of the tactical behind the scenes stuff. And what he shared with me was a really phenomenal, very sophisticated, very community specific, based largely on language and country of origin outreach program in Asian communities that I had never seen anywhere in the country before. And I was just kind of blown away. And the ground game as it existed for the Republican there, I thought was much better than what I was seeing on the other side. But, and here's where I thought the real fascinating development was what was going to happen with Vietnamese voters. were they going to maintain their strong Republican voting behavior? Or were we going to see for the first time what we were seeing with Latino voters, which is a break from this cementing, this melding of partisanship with ethnic identity? And in fact, that's what we saw. Tran overperformed for past history in Vietnamese precincts, which really accounted for the margin of victory there.
Which was like about 650 votes.
650 votes, which is all you need in a close race,
Yeah,
right?
and as John pointed out earlier, he actually lost in Orange County, and LA County was the tiny sliver of LA County was what helped him run up the score and to kind of staunch his losses in Little Saigon. Yeah.
So you have a Korean candidate, Republican incumbent. The Vietnamese voters went not decisively, but marginally enough with an ethnic candidate over their partisan habit of voting, which is it's a very small but obviously impactful finding. And for nerds like me, like this was like the holy grail. Like, oh my gosh, we just found the Ark of the Covenant. Like, here it is.
It's such an interesting test, right?
It is an
The
interesting
Republicans
test.
were arguing all year that actually voters would back the person who matched their political identity,
Precisely.
and Democrats were saying, actually, we think identity is going to be the key here.
And that's why in Orange County, to juxtapose that with a neighboring city like Santa Ana, where the exact opposite is happening, is a very significant statement about the changing partisan alliances of non-white voters. Because we have always had this impression that if you're non-white, all we really are looking at is what percentage you're performing for the Democratic Party for. That has been our historical understanding of non-white voters.
This is a perfect segue to,
Okay, well,
Barbara, I
move
know
on.
you wanted to talk about legislative races, and while we're in Orange County, we have to talk about Josh Newman and Stephen Choi. And to your point about voters' alliances and party affiliation, would you like to talk a little bit about what you think happened with that race and what it shows about like how voters' preferences are changing, or if they are?
Yes, and I can add on to what Mike was saying as well. And so in preparation for this panel, I reached out to friends in labor and wanted to understand how were decisions made in labor, where were tactics like prioritized and things. What I found fascinating, to Mike's point, was they made a decision 18 months ago that when they were going to send people from labor to other states to work swing states, that labor in Orange County would stay here, that they would in particular take bilingual labor workers and also hire their family members to specifically be assigned to precincts. And it was very well coordinated. And I say this with all the love of my heart because organized labor is an oxymoron. They are the most unorganized people in the whole wide world. But to their credit, they actually pulled through and did it, and kudos to them. And so we used this tactic years ago when we were flipping seats from red to blue around Sacramento. But they had a person assigned to a precinct for an entire year. So that person may only have 4 households in a precinct, but that person would go to the door, talk to them, call them later, say, hey, remember I talked to you at the door, and in their own native language. And it was an ongoing relationship building, so that when the election was coming and the ballot came, they'd call and say, hey, by the way, did you get your ballot? Because, they became friends, right? That was a very specific objective, and it proved successful. So will that be successful again? Depends on if the money's there, depends if they do that again. I mean, there's a lot of ifs, but that's, I think, really speaks to how important those races were to the labor side. And how the Josh Newman race.
Labor is a good note there.
I was going to say, it kind of
Want to give
segues.
like a bit of a background on what happened with those
Yes,
unions?
and so Josh Newman had been in the state Senate. He voted for a gas tax increase, got recalled, and ran again, got back elected. And so he's that poor guy. He's been kicked around like a rag doll. Redistricting happened, and he was basically without a district. So a very small percentage of his Senate district was in his new district. So he had to basically run in a brand new seat and introduce himself to a whole host of voters. At the same time, he really made one particular union very mad at him, AFSCME. And during his race, he was actually targeted by hit mailers and ads by a friendly voice, right? And so people are split on this, but I'm really confident that's really what killed his chances. As soon as that hit piece came out, his numbers just plummeted. Um, I lost my train of thought what the question was, but it's been a fascinating road. This
So
cycle.
interesting. But there's like very interesting kind of demographic and political trends there as well, right? Because the guy who's replacing him is an Asian American Republican who's also, I believe, the mayor of Irvine, right? Was. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's also talk while we're in Orange County. I know you wanted to talk about IEs, and I would like to talk about this too. You guys might be aware that there were a couple of huge outside expenditure committees that were spending in these House races. One of them was funded by Elon Musk. It was called the America PAC. And another was funded by the cryptocurrency industry. And they both spent really heavily to defend Michelle Steele. I don't think they played in the Dave Min, Scott Baugh race, but and if there's other IEs you want to add in, please feel free. But I'm curious to what extent you guys think that outside expenditures moved the needle on any of these like really swingy races.
I'm happy. This is like my favorite topic. I could do a whole panel just on this. So for your education, if you're not familiar, independent expenditures are really just a big, huge loophole in California politics. So if you're a candidate running for office, there's only so much money you can take per donor. You could only give me, if I'm a candidate, so much money. But if you guys want to organize and create your own independent expenditure, you could each put in $1 million. It doesn't even matter. And there, you do have to report it, but it's not on the same timeline. So as a candidate, I have to report them in certain ways. You as an independent expenditure can report it in different ways, and it's really difficult to track. So part of our job at the California Target Book is tracking those individual dollars that are really convoluted, and they get really, really complicated because if you're really skilled, you may set up 5 or 6 independent expenditures, fundraise into one, and then move dollars around. So it's really hard to figure out that that money is actually coming from an Elon Musk or an oil or whoever, right? So those people, those interested parties, especially in California politics and the state legislature, are becoming very, very skilled on how to move that money. They can have an outside fund where they fundraise for it all for 2 years and then move it into an IE at the last minute, and all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, there's $300,000 being spent against me tomorrow. So it's very, very stealth. Those independent expenditures are really, if you show that there's dozens of them, dozens and dozens and dozens, those make huge differences in these races. So running for office these days, you're not just going to the teachers and saying, hey, I'm going to be a great vote for teachers and nurses and firefighters. You then also have to go to everybody else who may oppose the teachers, nurses, and firefighters and make sure they don't hate you so that they don't have an independent expenditure spending against you. That really showed in the races in Orange County in particular, because it's such a swing state or swing county. So much money was spent here from way far away, from dollars from much further that have no footprint necessarily in Orange County. They could have vested interest for other reasons. They could be looking for that one vote they're going to need for the issue next year, but those dollars are coming from all over, not even just all over California, but all over the United States to come in and play in politics here.
It's really interesting. No, there's a couple other demographic things I want to hit on. We unfortunately need like 4 more hours for this panel, so we're going to gallop through it as best we can in the remaining 5 minutes that we have. But Dan, I know you'd mentioned you wanted to talk about the gender gap, and I'm wondering both how you see that playing out in Orange County and to what extent the messages that the Democratic Party thought would play with women, including abortion, access to reproductive care, whether that made a difference.
So this came up in the previous panel and a little bit earlier here today, but it is worth going back to, because in my mind, the single most mind-blowing statistic from all the exit poll data that came out of the November election was the split, as Ken referenced earlier, and as we heard about on the first panel, was the divide between pro-choice voters in this country. First of all, it's worth remembering that back in June of 2022, the day before the Supreme Court issued its Dobbs decision, public opinion polls in this country showed an almost precisely even split between voters who identified as pro-choice and pro-life. And that split had remained almost even for 25 to 30 years. In the 2.5 years since Dobbs, those numbers have jumped dramatically. And according to Gallup, 63% of Americans now consider themselves to be pro-choice, defined as supporting abortion under all or most circumstances. If you had told me if you had told me on November 4th that the pro-choice vote in America was going to split evenly, 49% to 49%, between Harris and Trump, I'm not sure I would have believed you. And had you told the Democratic National Committee that 6 months before the election, it's fair to think that they would have rethought a strategy that overwhelmingly relied on abortion as the issue that elect Kamala Harris. It seemed pretty clear going into the election that if Trump won, it was going to be off of border issues. And if Harris won, it was going to be off of issues relating to reproductive rights. And the fact that in a political environment, this goes back to the resentments I was talking about earlier, where voters are so upset about the economy, so upset about inflation, and particularly here in Southern California, so focused on the border and criminal justice, is the majority, or is that half of pro-choice voters said, I do believe a woman should have a right to choose, but it's not as important to my vote as one or more of these other issues. And coming back full around, the divide among that is a straight gender gap. Women who refer to themselves, who identify as pro-choice, overwhelmingly voted for Harris. Among that 49% of the electorate of pro-choice voters who supported Trump, the overwhelming majority of those were male voters, particularly young men. And those alienated, resentful, frustrated young men who didn't go to college probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about abortion issues. If they do, they will tell you truthfully that they believe that their sister or their wife or their girlfriend should be able to make that decision. But it's not a high enough ranking issue for them. And going back to your question earlier, is Tran, is Whiteside, is Gray, are the other Democrats who won in this election going to get reelected 2 years ago? I'd say that because the president's party, a president of the other party tends to lose seats in their first midterm election. The Democrats who won this year start with an advantage, but those who over-rely on the single issue are probably going to have a more difficult road to get there.
We have 2 minutes left, so this is a rapid fire. There's been much talk about California's rightward shift in this election. There were 9 counties that voted for Biden in 2020 that voted for Trump this time around, and some of those counties have huge swings. I'm curious if you guys think that this is a one-off, if this is something that was a statement about the economy or, the aftermath of COVID or the other issues that were mentioned on the first panel, or if you think this represents a meaningful kind of more long-term or more permanent shift in the thinking of the California electorate.
I will say, and I've been a little bit criticized by some data folks, which I take as a badge of honor. I have not seen these types of shifts in nearly 3 decades in this state. And what is interesting to me is this rightward shift that happened actually began in the 2022 midterms. What's even more interesting is, as I mentioned in the previous panel, California is an outlier on these changes. This has been happening for a decade in every other state. So if the Democrats aren't ringing 5 alarm bells to say we need to make adjustments now, it will be too late. And I say that as somebody who 30 years ago this month, with Dan Schnur in the room, was telling Republicans, there's some changes coming you need to be paying attention to because it could cost you for decades to come. I will say that to Democrats even louder because these shifts are as or more significant right now.
So don't let the data nerds bully you. And
I can hold my own with them.
But, you know, and what they're probably saying is, oh, it's just because Democrats didn't vote. Well, that's a
sign.
decision. That's a data point, right?
Precisely.
That's, you know, you got to decide to vote and then decide who you're going to vote, who you're going to vote for. Just one last point. One of the reasons why I think we saw a general rightward shift in the country is the Trump campaign aired more national advertising than we have ever seen. So someone mentioned the football game ads. The reason why you saw presidential ads is because they bought them on national football. So it's people who have never seen presidential advertising. Like, none of you have ever seen presidential advertising before in California. You saw it for the first time, as did people in Kansas and all sorts of other places that never would see presidential advertising. And so I think Democrats and Republicans in places who had never had to exercise their campaign or message muscles may need to exercise them now.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I'm sorry, Dan, we are already over, and I want to make sure we make time for the next panel. Thank you all very much. Thank you, thank you.
We are fortunate this morning to have Congresswoman Katie Porter from the 47th Congressional District and Newport Beach Mayor Will O'Neill, who's also on the executive committee of the Republican Party here, to be moderated by Lauren Rosenhall, who came down from Sacramento. She leads all the political coverage for the LA Times and has previously been on the editorial board. I suspect this will be one of the most interesting moderating jobs of the morning. So on to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with both of you and all of you. Thank you. So we are here to kind of look ahead for this panel. And I wanted to start off by asking you to talk about the California versus Trump narrative. We've all lived through one round of that. Obviously, as we've been discussing, the state, has had some rightward shift in this election, but California remains a state that's entirely controlled by Democrats, and we know they have strong feelings about President Trump. So what do you see ahead in the next 4 years in terms of how this Trump administration will be the same for California as what we saw in the past, and how it will be different? And I'd like the Congress member to begin, and then I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so first I'll just observe with respect to Mayor O'Neill, that California isn't controlled at every level by Democrats, and that at the local level and at County Board of Supervisors, we actually have a lot of Republican-controlled areas and cities, and so that will continue to be true. I think it's when we look at the state legislature and up that we really see that Democratic dominance, and I do think this creates a little bit of a gap when people say California is all Democratic. I don't think anyone who got elected in Orange County would ever say that, right? We are a mixed community, and I think a good incubator for being able to answer this question. I think right now, people in California are sort of holding, their frustration or anger. It's really fear right now. It's just a vague anxiety. What will Trump do? What will it mean for us in California? And we have seen in election cycles, when we tried, for instance, to run on that national Republicans in office might mean a full-on federal abortion ban, that Californians didn't really buy it. They don't want a federal abortion ban, but they don't really think it's coming here. And so I think there's a little bit of anxiety about Trump, a lot of anxiety, but very little action right now. I will say I think we've seen the governor take a very different tactic this time. Governor Newsom be very affirmative. He came to DC shortly after the election. He's really working hard, thinking about how he can shore up some things. We have the special session in the legislature to try to do that. But I think, I think we're not going to see, there's going to be a faster runway. So like Trump is able to get going quicker. He's done this once before, right? And he doesn't have the same cabinet. So his first cabinet, particularly his first cabinet when he got elected, had a lot of mainstream, long-standing, well-respected Republicans. That's not this cabinet. This is a cabinet of enablers. And he's been very clear about that. So I think this is going to move quickly when it comes. And so I do think it's smart for California as a state to be thinking about what do we need to have shored up. But we're not seeing the protests, we're not seeing people marching in the streets, we're not seeing the Women's March and all of that. And I think people are just sort of waiting, with some of them with a sense of dread in particular communities or those with particular viewpoints.
And Mayor O'Neill, what do you think might be the same and what might be different?
Yeah, so a couple things. Number one, I actually tore my Achilles about 4 months ago, and so I'm still in tennis shoes, so I apologize for that, but I did wear festive socks, so we've got that going. Number two, I grew up in Fresno, lived up in the Bay Area for 6 years, and then came down to Orange County. Those 6 years were spent going to college and law school, so according to the speakers before this, I apparently should be a Democrat. But in the one thing that you would find out about me is I'm the Newport Beach mayor, which would tell you immediately I'm a Republican, which puts me very much in the minority in this room, and I recognize that. So I'm just going to tell you, I hope you'll keep an open mind as I'm talking about a lot of this, because you're probably hearing some of this for the first time. I would say real quickly, Governor Newsom is banking pretty far left right now. When he went back to DC, he only met with the Democratic caucus, refused to meet with the Republican caucus. When he said, I'm going to have a special session, immediately the narrative was he's going to Trump-proof California. And let me tell you real quickly how to actually Trump-proof California. He actually needs to govern competently, and so does the state legislature. And they are completely incapable of doing that right now. We have either the first or second most expensive gasoline in the country. We have the second most expensive electricity in the country. We have the second highest unemployment rate in the country here in California. When you were talking about the budget, we were looking at by far the largest deficit in the history of any state. We are looking at a $2 billion deficit going into the next fiscal year, with $20 to $30 billion projected on deficits for the next 3 years after that. We have a high-speed rail project that is the laughingstock of the entire country. If you don't think Donald Trump is going to be talking about that during this coming administration, you are not paying attention to what he's already talking about now. Because we've already been talking about $100 billion over budget for that high-speed rail project that still has not connected even 2 cities in the Central Valley. And I can tell you, having grown up in Fresno, I do not need to get from Merced to Bakersfield quickly. But certainly not at the cost that it's in right now. You want to talk about homelessness? That is something that I can tell you right now everyone thinks about. Since 2019, when Governor Newsom came into the governor position, it has increased by 30,000 people. 30,000, that's more than Laguna Beach. 30,000 more people are on the streets, and I think that's an undercount, and I think you probably do too. We're looking at 181,000 people as of last year, according to the federal government, that are homeless in California. And we have spent $24 billion at the state level trying to get that under control. And when the state auditor went in this past year to say, hey, we need to fix this, they couldn't even track the money. So let me just tell you real quickly how to actually do this. Again, govern competently. Because yesterday, I can tell you, in Newport Beach, we just announced in the last 12 months, we have decreased homelessness by 85%. 85%. In my 8 years on council, violent crime has gone down around 16%. And I'll just finish this one up real quickly, Laurel. The one thing that was not discussed almost at all on these first 2 panels was crime. Californians feel unsafe. And you know darn well we do, because Prop 36 just passed by about 70%. George Gascon was booted out of office. They recalled the progressive district attorney in Alameda. Oakland recalled its mayor. San Francisco voted out its mayor. The progressive majority in San Francisco was voted out for the first time since 2019, I believe. This is the #1 issue. And when they called the special session and talked about how unaffordable California is and they're going to fix that, not one discussion about crime, not one. And that is going to come back to bite Democrats really hard in 2 years if that's not a main focus.
Okay, well, you jumped ahead to my second question already, which was, what was some of the main takeaways for each party in this election, and how do we think it will play out over the next 2 to 4 years? And so you mentioned crime. That was certainly an obvious takeaway from the results here in California, and cost of living. Nationally, that was a big message that contributed to Democrats' defeat. And it's enormous in California. Homelessness, rent, groceries, gasoline, all of those things. So how do you see that, those kinds of cost of living issues playing out in the next couple of years? And for Democrats who run this state, like what should they be doing to connect with voters more on those issues?
Yeah, so I'll say two things. It's not that Democrats need to, quote, connect with voters, quote. I actually agree with the mayor here on this one point. They actually need to do things. So it's not about what you say. At some point, you have to have some proof points. And I think President Biden and the Democratic administration had a number of good proof points on things like manufacturing jobs, green energy, but they didn't have proof points on what are most families' three biggest expenses: housing, childcare, and college. So I think there's a gap here between like the focus on the eggs and the milk, which I actually know what those things cost, and kind of what really eats up your budget and makes it feel unaffordable. And those big building blocks are where we haven't had a lot of, frankly, good ideas. I don't think coming out of either party. I think Democrats to some extent have been talking about housing. Certainly Governor Newsom was a little ahead of the curve in talking about homelessness and housing going back several years. Has he solved that problem? No, but I would also say that I don't believe any community has really solved it other than to bus it to their neighboring city. And so I think there are we need to think about federal policies and state policies around those big building block costs. I will also say the problem with these big building blocks is no state can do it alone. Housing has a lot to do with federal finance structures, with FHFA, with Fannie, with Freddie, there's a lot of federal layers. Now, there are state layers, and we are seeing Democrats in the state legislature, including folks like Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, State Senator Scott Wiener, and others, be willing to poke at and dismantle some long-standing Democratic bedrock laws, like the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, in order to create more housing. They've been willing to stand up to labor and to say, look, like, we don't have enough labor union members to build houses. That's not who builds houses in California. You guys have got green energy jobs. You guys are doing commercial construction. So I do think we're starting to see the legislature get there, but it is really hard for anyone who thinks that California can single-handedly solve all these problems without a partner at the federal government. It's going to be pretty tough. And I want to be clear, President Trump is not going to bring down costs of living for Californians or anyone else in this country. He does not have any meaningful housing plan, none. His last housing secretary, Ben Carson, did not know what an REO was. Remember, he thought it was a chocolate sandwich cookie, an Oreo. We are not, what we have heard from him on bringing costs down is that a lot of talk, that he'll make it better, but I haven't seen any plan that any economist, including far-right economists who come from quite a conservative orientation, say that is going to work. So when tariffs start landing, people are going to understand real quickly that he doesn't have a magic bullet for these cost things. I don't think Democrats do either. I think I've been saying this for 8 years, Democrats need to run more on the economy. Democrats are the party that delivers a strong, growing, competitive economy, and we need to run on that. And we often don't, because we've spent the last 8 years running on, we're not as bad as that guy. Low bar to say you're not as bad as Trump. And so I do think Democrats need a stronger message on the economy, and I think we need stronger, but frankly, better ideas on the economy than we have seen.
And so that idea of running on the economy, do you see that playing into, say, like our governor's race in a couple of years?
I do. I mean, I think that whoever's going to become governor, whoever's going to run in state assembly seats, I do think crime is going to be an issue. Everyone wants to feel safe. There is just, people want to feel safe. That is a human impulse. People also want to take care of their families. and they want to be safe financially. And so I think both of those things are going to be really important. So I do think people want to see someone who's leading the a state assembly and a state legislature who is willing to stand up to some of the entrenched interests in Sacramento and say, we've done your things now for 20 years. And we've gotten to a point now where we've got to go back a little the other direction. We've got to try a different idea than your idea. And I think that can be done without losing California's core values of opportunity, of equality, of freedom. I think that those core values take you to a strong growing economy if you talk about them correctly and if you deliver on them correctly.
So your own tenure in the House will be coming to an end in a few weeks. There's great curiosity among political journalists in the room about your future and whether you intend to run for governor here. What are you thinking about? What are you sort of considering as you weigh that decision? What are the factors that you're considering when you are thinking about that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's thinking about California, about the state, about why people come here, why people stay here, how do we continue to attract people here, whether Californians, and the governor has a lot of statistics about people coming and going and that they're not really coming and they're not really going and, you know, but the problem is it's a feeling. It's a feeling that people have that maybe California's glory days are behind it. But the thing with California, and this is what I've been doing a lot of, I mean, I just got a bunch of book recommendations from Mark Baerback on like the history of California. Going back to the gold rush, like California has always had this sort of imaginative, explosive growth, and then it as a big fizzle out. I mean, we're sitting in Orange County. Remember when we went bankrupt in the 1980s? I'm a bankruptcy lawyer. I still teach that case. So I think that people really, we need to be thinking about sort of what do we deliver on that every Californian can support? Not just the Democrats, not just the institutional Democrats. The biggest takeaway for me from this entire election is that Democrats and Republicans both have there is an ecosystem now that self-reinforces, almost like think about an animal that hits the thing and the treat dispenses, okay? Say something outrageous about Trump, treat dispenses. Say that we should lock up a Biden, treat dispenses. Get a like, go on MSNBC, say something outrageous, get an offer to go on TV. Write a mean email, $5 donations flood in. There's an ecosystem to sort of feed people thinking about the base all of the time because there's a reward mechanism with regard to the base that didn't used to be there. The reward mechanism used to come more at election time, right? Now it's every day. You're going viral, you're getting this, you're getting that. All of that keeps politicians on both sides of the aisle really connected to the most extreme members. I don't mean necessarily extreme bad, I just mean like the most base members. And it means they're not talking to the people who think every politician's a crook, who think that democracy is a joke, who think that it doesn't matter who they vote for, who thinks that nothing ever really gets solved, who have real concerns about daily things, whether it's crime or the cost of eggs. And so you have like I think that the person who's gonna be politically successful in the future is gonna be somebody who figures out how to listen to the people who are disaffected and disengaged and to help the base listen to them more. Because every time after election, people say, we should have listened to these swing voters. Oh, we should have listened to them. Who knew? Right? I mean, anybody who's getting elected in Orange County knows, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, because you're talking to a lot of swing voters. And then a week later, they say, Trump sucks, give me $10. And they email that out to 1 million people. And so I think that is really broken. And I think we should be cautious about how that reward cycle of going back and forth with the base is causing us to systematically ignore and not see what the most important issues are to the biggest chunk of people and to communicate and deliver on them effectively.
I'm curious if you agree with that point that the Congress member just made.
So one of the reasons that a lot of people gave President Biden kudos during 2020 during the primary cycle was that he ran like Twitter wasn't real life. And then one of the main criticisms was he governed like it was, where you have this ecosphere where the farthest left or farthest right of a party exists, where they're in that echo chamber, and if you can break out of it and talk to people about real issues, quality of life, costs, crime, you name it, you will attract a lot of people to your cause. And I can tell you, being mayor gets you out of that ecosystem pretty darn quick, because every 2 weeks we have a council meeting where we're actually trying to be effective and respond to things that we've gotten right and things that we've gotten wrong. And on the homelessness side, one of the things that I'm actually particularly proud of was that I helped negotiate a joint shelter between Newport Beach and Costa Mesa, which is the only joint shelter between two cities that I know of in the county, which is one of the reasons we were able to decrease homelessness by 85% in Newport. So I know the congresswoman wasn't referencing Newport Beach about busing people to other cities, because that just wouldn't be true. But my point on this is the next person that's going to be speaking to the voters in 2 years better be able to speak to all of these issues that people actually do care about on the homelessness side, on housing, on crime, on cost of living. These are real issues. And look, the current spokesman, Governor of California, who just recently purchased a $9.1 million home in Marin County, is not the person that a lot of people are going to look at as the one who understands. And I do think that if the Congresswoman runs for governor, one of the issues I'm sure some of her folks on the left are going to talk about is the subsidized housing here as a professor at UCI. Because you've got to be able to talk to people. You've got to be able to talk to people about this. I know it came up during the Senate race, which is why I'm mentioning it. But I think that if a lot of people are looking at this and saying, look, this is what I want to go run on, and you want to talk about education, education is a real issue in the state of California. And up in Los Angeles Unified School District, they just announced the results about 4 or 5 months ago. 20.7% of black students were at the state minimum for, I can't recall if it was reading, I believe it was literacy or math. That's embarrassing, and it's awful, and that's a bipartisan issue that everyone cares about. So there are these things right now where if you're in power, and the Democratic supermajority is right now up in Sacramento, there are a lot of things that need to be embarrassed by, that have nothing to do with partisan politics, but have everything to do with the outcomes. And so when I know that there was a discussion on the last panel talking about the issue of there's a split right now among the Democratic Party, you do see it. It's the split between the Progressive Caucus and the Liberal Caucus, and that really matters because the outcomes of all of these policy decisions are affecting people's lives and need to be discussed.
So given that a Republican, by the time we have our governor's race in 2 years, a Republican will not have won statewide in California in 20 years at that point. And despite the, rightward shift that we saw in this election, there's no indication that like a statewide victory is on the near horizon for a Republican. So what's the move for California Republicans in the governor's race? Is it to get behind a Republican candidate who would likely serve as a sacrificial lamb in that race? Or is it to form an alliance and a coalition, as you were talking about the divide between progressives and moderates, and back a Democrat who shares a lot of the same values and pro-business, et cetera, and force a top 2 Democrat on Democrat general election for governor between 2 Democrats who are really, really different, and one maybe that some Republicans could support? What's the move for Republicans in the governor's race?
Well, I don't speak for millions of Republicans when I say I don't really know the answer to that one. But my suspicion is that we'll see a handful of Republicans run. I suspect Steve Hilton will probably run. Chad Bianco, the Riverside sheriff, may end up running. But you're right, it is beyond an inside straight draw right now for a Republican to be the next governor. My suspicion is that Republicans will back a Republican in the jungle primary, and if it's 2 Democrats, then you're going to, in the general, then I think the call will have to be made on who people are going to vote for. There's a lot of people on the Democratic side already talking about or opening committees on this one to run. Eleni Kounalakis, Tony Atkins. I suspect Rick Caruso will probably jump in. Look, I'd be really curious to have seen, for example, given the way that 2024 just played out, I'd really be interested to see if Rick Caruso would have won that mayor's race in Los Angeles this year instead of 2 years ago against Karen Bass. I think it would have been a lot closer, and he might have. So if he jumps in, that might be an interesting person for Republicans to at least consider if it's a Democrat versus a Democrat.
And what do you see when you look at the field for the governor's race? Do you and how might Kamala Harris factor into your decision or others in looking at that race?
So I think the field will probably both expand and contract. I think there are people who are running now who are likely to move on to other races or move on to other things. And I think there are people who are likely to enter who have not done so yet. So I think both on the Democratic and the Republican side, the field is still fluid, as it should be 2 full years out from the election. I think, there's actually some hubris to thinking that you have it all figured out 4 years before the election comes. Like, it takes time to figure out what you're going to run on and what you want to do and how you're going to do it. I think if Vice President Harris were to choose to run, I am certain that would have a near field clearing effect on the Democratic side. I also think that would mean that Republicans would continue to run and lose. But I don't know that she'll do that. I don't think anybody can know what she's going to do, and it's up to her. But I do think the field, like we have a lot of other statewide offices, and we don't have many people slotted into running for those yet. So I think there's just going to be a sort of a shuffling for the next 6 to 9 months before we end up with kind of the stable field of people who are going to compete through that primary.
I know that, identity politics has been discussed as part of the problem that Democrats had in this election. And you have some interesting ideas about sort of like how Democrats did it right and how they did it wrong. And I'd love to hear you kind of tell the room about your thoughts on Democrats' use of identity politics.
Yeah, so this is the sort of one of the common critiques, which you just basically summarized, is we ran on identity politics, we did, quote, too much identity politics, and therefore we lost. First, we actually did pretty well. This was a really close election all the way around, not only at the presidential level, but at the House, where it is extremely close. Democrats won a lot of statewide offices in other states, including states that Trump won, right? I think the issue with identity politics is, what do we mean when we say identity? I don't think Democrats have talked nearly enough about class issues, about economic issues, and about opportunity. That is also part of someone's identity, right? How do you identify? Are you working class? Are you middle class? Are you poor? Are you working poor? Are you rich? How do you think about that? And people categorize themselves in lots of ways that sometimes don't even map onto their income. Like when you've met the middle class person earning $3 million, you're like, right, in California, like if you try to take that to Iowa, like that's not a winning policy. So I would say that Democrats have not talked nearly enough about class identity and about that side of identity, and about age and about generation. So we saw, an older, like a lot of Democrats stayed home, and younger Democrats were part of that. And so I think, when we talk about identity politics, we're really being reduced to conversations about race and ethnicity. And that is a very important part of identity, but it is not the only way that people identify. So I think we ought to be talking to parents. That's a very important part of people's identity. So what do you want as a parent? I want my kids off the couch. Who's with me? I want them to have jobs in California. I want them to be able to afford their own home. Not mine, right? This is a really important part of identity that we could lean into more. Seniors and retirement. This is a big challenge, including in Orange County and many parts of California. We had a big population boom in the 70s. Those people are now aging. Talk about retirement. We saw how people respond if you talk about senior issues, right? So I think that the idea that you don't talk to people about who they are is nuts. That's really what I think identity politics should mean, but it's become shorthand for sort of like basic, like, I'm this, so you're gonna vote for me because you're also this. And I think that falls flat
Do you
for,
think
for
we'll
many
see,
voters.
will we see less of that from Democrats in the coming cycles?
I don't know. I don't know. I was commenting yesterday to someone, there have been 2 or 3 really good articles written about Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, my colleague from Washington State, and about she runs an auto body shop. She went to college, a good college, but she runs an auto body shop, and she has shown a willingness to push back when she feels like President Biden is thinking only about sort of college-educated voters and not thinking about others. And there's these really good articles, and they keep being shared around the Democratic ecosystem among Congress members, and they're all like, this is really good, we should think about this. And then like a week later, they're like, I endorse this person. And it's like, that person's the same person that we, right? So I think institutional change is slow. So, but there's a moment here, there's an opportunity. And on the age thing, I just think this is really, really important. Joe Biden's younger voter was anyone under 50. I'm 50. Let me make there are real wrinkles up here. I'm not young. I'm firmly in the middle and loving it. But we have got to start recognizing that for truly younger voters, or even younger voters, let's just go with 40s and 30s, their first memory of an election was hanging chads in Florida, and it has basically been downhill since. So vague, abstract talk about democracy and fascism is just not gonna land for them, right? And if you just elect a Democrat, it'll all be better, doesn't land for them, because in their lifetime, housing hasn't gotten more affordable. In their lifetime, you think about the fact that many of you in this room went to the University of California for free. And now, it's $35,000 in state. And so that is we have to be more honest with younger voters, and we have to listen to them more, because they might not vote in the same numbers when they're young, but here's the thing about younger voters that I can promise you, and I think even this mayor on this stage would agree with me about this. Younger voters eventually become older voters. And that means that they're
I
gonna
agree.
start.
That's a good point.
See, I'm a bridge builder. So we really need to start thinking about that. So I think there are identities that we are just not paying nearly enough attention to, rather than just sort of saying there's some generic one-size-fits-all policy and you can just generically talk to people. It's more understanding, how do people identify? Because you've got 2 people on the stage here who are maybe 2 of the only people in Orange County who get up in the morning and they say, who am I? I'm a father or mother, I'm a parent, in my case, I'm a lawyer, I'm a Democrat. Most people don't say that to themselves, right? They say, I'm a grandparent, I'm an employee, I'm a Catholic, I'm a whatever. And so that's the naked identity, both on race and ethnicity and on kind of partisanship, that I think is a losing. We've taken that further than I think it should go. But other kinds of identity, I don't think we've even begun to tap how to communicate with people on that.
So one thing that happened that was interesting in the races this year for Republicans was that they won 3 legislative seats. They flipped 3 legislative seats, and those were all Republicans who are people of color. And then Republicans obviously lost the 3 competitive House seats that we talked about earlier that Democrats flipped. So what do you think happened there? And was there an element of identity politics in those races that hurt or helped Republicans in their own way in each of those seats?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Orange County, so Orange County's 3.2 million people. We're essentially the same population size as the state of Nevada. I think people forget how big this place is and how diverse it really is.
I agree with you.
Yes. Wish I had a whiteboard. I would have chalked that one up. But I'll say real quickly, so identity politics is an interesting discussion, but it's really more about reflecting your community. And so we've got 34 cities here in Orange County. Every city is totally different. but they all have pretty common issues. So I know Valerie Mesqua, the mayor of Santa Ana, was here earlier, and I don't see her anymore. But I think she reflects a lot of her community pretty well. And so when you're looking at so take Newport Coast Drive for example. If you drive down Newport Coast Drive, you're going to get at the end of it when you hit PCH a sign that says Laguna Beach left and Newport Beach right. And I always think that's correct. But you have this interesting dynamic where we have 34 cities. 23 of them right now are majority Republican. 6 of them are entirely Republican, and 10 of the cities are Democrat majority, and 3 of them are pure Democrat councils. It's a pretty diverse group of folks who represent their cities. And so when you go to city to city to city, you're going to see different racial makeups of each city, which oftentimes reflects the community that they're actually representing. And when you see that, that tends to say, look, we need to recruit candidates that people want to vote for. There is an awful difficult chance. It's awfully difficult sometimes to go out and recruit people to go run for office these days. It's awful to run for office. People say the worst things about you. You have to go out and fundraise. You need to go knock on doors. I remember when I ran in 16, I knocked on over 3,000 doors, and I only got bit by 1 dog. But it was little, it's tiny. But you've got to be able to recruit people in who people are willing to vote for. And so my suspicion is that when we're looking at the way 2024 played out, and you see a lot more red on the interior side of California, even Imperial County, which is I think around 85% Hispanic, voted for Donald Trump this cycle. And I think it was something like 25 plus Biden in the last cycle. So yeah, there is a massive shift right now and a realignment of people willing to vote for a Republican perhaps for the first time in their lives. And so when we saw people who were flipping seats, they were really reflective of their communities. They understood them. They grew up there, and people were willing to vote for them because they felt like they saw themselves and the policies they wanted reflected in those candidates. And I think we're going to continue to see that, frankly, throughout California. I would not be surprised if Republicans flip back a number of the seats, including, and I know you all are going to be annoyed about this, I think Derek Tran's going to have a really hard time in 2 years, especially if a particular candidate were to jump in on that race. And I think, frankly, Dave Minn's going to have a really hard time in 2 years if another particular candidate jumps in. So,
Which particular candidates are you talking about?
Nope. But I can just tell you, I mean, it's not hard to see. I'm sure Mike Madrid's not here anymore. Mike would know who I'm talking about. But my point though is, yeah, we're gonna have to recruit candidates that reflect the values and the culture of communities in order to convince people that they're worth voting for, even in non-presidential years, where all of a sudden we saw this realignment nationally.
Well, to wrap up, I wonder if you could share when you think you'll make your decision about whether you're going to run for governor. And anything else you might want to share in closing remarks.
Laurel, no, thank you. I will say that, look, we've heard this when I first was elected. First I was told that I couldn't be elected. Then I was told that I couldn't be reelected. Then I was told that when they redistrict you, you can't get reelected. And then I was told only Katie Porter can win this seat, so Dave Minn can't get elected. At some point, it's not about what people say at the Lincoln Club, it's about what voters want. And I think that, they have work to do on that. And that has, they are doing it. He's absolutely right that at the local level, we are still electing a lot of Republicans. And I think Republicans, some of whom I think are doing a really good job. And so I think there is a path there, but it's not gonna come from kind of naked threats and trying to scare Democrats off in Orange County. For an awful lot of years, that worked. It's like doomed to lose mentality. And I think we're over that. And the infrastructure that Democrats have built is now as strong and as vibrant. as I think what Republicans have long had in Orange County. And so the number of people who know what to do and know what a winning campaign looks like, it's just really changed in my 8 years. And I think there are a lot of people, including some in this room, who deserve a lot of credit for that. So I think Republicans are going to find that they are going to have to find better candidates. They are going to have to run better campaigns. Just nakedly saying, "Hi, I'm a Republican and I'm here," isn't going to get you elected in Orange County anymore. Outside of some cities and some small races. And so they may be up for that challenge, but I think Democrats are too.
Thank you. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Well, to close things out, I think we can all agree that we are most appreciative of our panelists for being with us today. I want to thank again our co-hosts today, the Los Angeles Times, as well as the Haynes Foundation, which has been quite supportive of our work at the poll. I also want to thank you, the members of the audience, for caring about these subjects and taking time out of your busy schedules to come here today. I don't think it can be said enough that community engagement is an essential pillar to building and sustaining a strong democracy. So I want to thank all of you for caring and caring enough to be here. I will also add that today's discussions are hardly the end of the School of Social Ecology's engagement on these topics. I mentioned our poll that is being released today. That is the QR code, but we are going to make this easy for you. Anyone who registered ahead of time will send out an email later today, over the week, or over the weekend with a copy of the poll attached to it. So you will be able to get your very own copy. I also want you to look for the next iteration of our poll in January, which is going to be released shortly before Inauguration Day, and it is going to be illustrating many of the challenges ahead for national and local leaders in addressing many of the issues that were mentioned by voters. These include such subjects as were mentioned today: economic issues, abortion, crime, border. You're going to be surprised by what some of your fellow Orange County residents said. Let me bring things to a close by thanking our very hardworking staff in the School of Social Ecology. For making this all possible. Let me leave you with two things. Number one, this purple tie is for a reason. This truly is a purple county that we live in right now, and it really is the bellwether of changes that we are seeing going on in the nation. So take pride in our county and help get the word out nationally about the fact that this is the place where things are happening. And finally, whatever your political affiliation or ideology is, I want to wish you the happiest of the coming holidays, and let us hope that together our Purple County can help light a way forward for the country. With that, thank you all very much.